Chapter 1445 Crushing Power. In fact, in this abyss, even saint tools would be suppressed, not being able to unleash their full power. Thus, it was only natural that pseudo-saint tools would be suppressed even more. However, saintly material was saintly material, after all. This was analogous to how rank 3 king tiers would still be slightly more powerful than rank 2 and rank 1 king tiers, even when their cultivation level was suppressed. Nie Tiancheng's 3 opponents had only been rank 1 king tiers, so how could they have opposed him, a rank 2 king tier? Moreover, the gap between them was only broadened by Nie Tiancheng's pseudo-saint tool. The 3 rank 1 king tiers being defeated wasn't surprising in the least. However, the fact that they had been defeated so quickly still caused Ling Han to feel slightly astonished. He couldn't help but take an extra glance at the peach branch. When can I dig the child tree up and move it into the Black Tower? He wanted to eat celestial peaches. Although these celestial peaches couldn't live up to their name anymore, they could only be regarded as immortal peaches. Ling Han didn't mind this. The Flying Rain Saint would definitely howl in anger if he knew about Ling Han's thoughts. You might not mind, but I mind. That's my celestial tree. After absorbing the 3 floating rocks, Ling Han and the others rose to a height of 9 meters. Because the floating rocks had been evenly absorbed by them, they naturally couldn't shoot to the same height as if one of them had absorbed all 3 of the floating rocks. However, they didn't mind this, and they continued to snatch the floating rocks of others. After being defeated here, one wouldn't lose the right to compete. Instead, they merely needed to start over again. Thus, the fallen team of 3 immediately found another 3 floating rocks and rose into the sky. They had only just begun anyway, so their losses hadn't been big. Meanwhile, Ling Han and the others came across a team of 7. This team approached them aggressively, yet their expressions changed drastically the instant that they laid their eyes on Empress Luan Xing. They frantically turned around to escape, not even daring to engage in battle. Nie Tiancheng, the North Emperor, and the others were all extremely confused. What was going on? Were they already so powerful that they could scare others off with just their aura alone? However, Ling Han and his companions smiled knowingly. Empress Luan Xing had the title of King Tier Assassin. Although most people were only aware of her title and not her appearance, it was evident that the fleeing team of 7 did know about her looks. Moreover, it was extremely likely that they had suffered at her hands before. Thus, they had been petrified immediately upon seeing her, fleeing without even daring to engage in battle. The Empress was a rank 3 king tier. Even though her cultivation had been suppressed, she would still possess an overwhelming advantage over them. Not only that, but Ling Han's team had also reached the maximum number of 12. They continued to cruise upward. Most of the time, it was just Nie Tiancheng and Shan Jingyi doing the hard work, each of them trying their best to impress Empress Luan Xing. In fact, Shan Jingyi was also quite extraordinary, possessing a god tool that was formed from several types of rare godly stones. This god tool was only the size of a palm, yet it was incredibly heavy. When it was tossed toward an opponent, it could definitely wound their flesh and break their bones, regardless of how powerful their defenses were. It wasn't forged from saintly material, but instead composed from level 16 or so godly stones. However, after being tempered by a saint, it could be regarded as a top-notch god tool, even among the Eternal River tier. This god tool was called the 6 Elements Mountains, a name that was very similar to the 6 Mountain Saints title. In fact, this was indeed a replica of the 6 Mountain Saints saint tool. Not only could it be used to smash people, but it could even expand into a mountain. When it fell, it would be able to flatten everything beneath it. Shan Jingyi and Nie Tiancheng teamed up, relying on the might of their 2 treasures to defeat anyone who dared to stand in their way. Few people could withstand their formidable power. Half a day passed, and they had already reached a height of 300 meters. However, this was only 1/10 of the way up the valley. They were still extremely far from the large boulder that was hovering above the valley. Although there was always a victor for the competition in the Sunken Abyss Valley, no one had ever managed to reach the height of the giant boulder before. This was directly related to the quality and number of competitors. Even if there were someone who was more talented than anyone in history and peerless in the world, they would still fail to reach the giant boulder if there weren't enough competition to enable this. Only when talent was bountiful and the competition was intense would it be possible for a king among kings to emerge. This person would tread upon the heads of countless other king tiers as they gradually rose to the peak. Right now, Gu Dawi was gazing at the giant boulder in the sky, the images of the universe and heavenly bodies flashing across his eyes. Countless great stars were born and destroyed. If Ling Han saw this, he would definitely realize that this was the power of creation and destruction. By possessing both of these powers at once, one would be able to tear apart the barrier in space and forge a path to the celestial realm. Anyhow, this wasn't strange. After all, Gu Dawi had originally been a prodigy of the celestial realm, someone who had already surpassed the peak of the immortal level. Right now, he had been reborn with a divine fetus, and this naturally sped his cultivation up even more. Thus, he would face no barrier between cultivation levels. However, he would still be limited by his cultivation level, after all, so he couldn't genuinely wield his power of creation and destruction. Even so, there was still a faint hint of saintly might emanating from his body. It was also because of this that he was able to subdue so many king tiers. Around him, there were a whopping 23 king tiers standing respectfully on their floating rocks. Although the maximum number for a team was 12 people, there was nothing stopping them from forming 2 teams. The king tiers all wore fervent expressions as they stood guard around Gu Dawi, and it was as if they were gazing at a god. Without him needing to move, Gu Dawi's 2 teams of guards easily disposed of any opponents in their way. In fact, there were even rank 2 king tiers among his followers. When Gu Dawi saw Ling Han and the others, his gaze lingered on Empress Luan Xing for a moment longer. However, he didn't command his followers to attack them. There was no need to rush. In any case, a fresh fruit like her should be personally captured by him. Ling Han and the others rose up with surprisingly little resistance. After all, the competition had only just begun, so there were still many inferior prodigies who weren't king tiers trying to test their luck. If they came across king tiers, their fate would generally be sealed. As they rose higher and higher, it also became more and more difficult to find suitable opponents. With the intensity of the competition, the weaker prodigies were completely unable to rise to great heights. Whenever they reached a great height, they would be ruthlessly defeated and knocked down, again and again. Those who could maintain their positions at great heights were all genuine elites. Right now, there were almost 1,000 teams in the first echelon. Meanwhile, there were countless cultivators beneath them, all trying to fight their way up. Since the defeated cultivators could start over again, there would naturally be an endless stream of cultivators rising up for them to defeat. Of course, this was given that there was still enough time. Reaching the height of the valley signals the conclusion of the first stage. From there on up, it's forbidden to fight as a team. Moreover, according to hearsay, no one has ever been able to ascend the final 300 meters. According to the pattern of the previous competitions, when the first person or team reaches the same height as the valley, the competition of the Sunken Abyss Valley will also begin a countdown. From that point onward, the competition will only last for 3 more days. When this time expires, the person standing at the greatest height will be crowned as the winner of the competition. Anyhow, after all these years, everyone is extremely curious to find out what happens if someone manages to ascend the giant boulder at the top. Or in other words, everyone is curious to see whether they'll receive some never-before-seen reward. It's a pity that no one had ever succeeded before. The North Emperor and Stone Emperor spoke in an alternating manner again. They had already reached a height of 2,400 meters, and this was already not far from the peak of the valley. This also signified that their alliance was about to come to an end. "Someone's coming," Nie Tiancheng suddenly exclaimed. He gazed forward, killing intent oozing from his body. Ling Han glanced over, yet he immediately reached over to stop Nie Tiancheng from attacking. "Those are my friends." This was a team of 5 people, 4 of whom Ling Han recognized faceless: Yang Lin, Yu Ying, and the Cloud Maiden. "Brother Ling." The 4 people immediately called in greeting. Ling Han nodded in reply before starting to greet them one by one. In fact, their team of 5 wasn't especially powerful. However, they had Yang Lin on their team. This was someone with the title of Heaven's Blessed Child. Indeed, Yang Lin was someone who could casually find a saint tool when wandering around. Thus, they had generally only come across weaker cultivators on their ascent to this height. In other words, they had actually managed to reach this height without much difficulty. Ling Han felt that they should stop ascending after reaching a height of 3,000 meters. Firstly, they could maintain their power as a team, looking out for and protecting each other. Secondly, they could avoid coming across any top-notch king tier. When the time limit of 3 days was about to expire, they could then make the jump to the second stage, thereby gaining the right to receive the blessings of heaven and earth. In any case, the floating rocks only had a movement range of 6 meters in the up and down direction. Thus, they could easily achieve this goal if they calculated their positions carefully. Chapter 1446 Questioning. Nie Tiancheng was extremely pissed off. Ling Han actually dared to block him? Holy fuck. They were here to fight for a great opportunity, not to catch up with old friends. There was an icy look in his eyes, yet upon recalling their plan, he forcefully suppressed his urge to explode in anger after reaching the height of the valley. He and Shan Jingyi would launch a surprise attack and knock him off his floating rock. They would make him fall from heaven to hell. That would definitely be a feeling of unparalleled despair for Ling Han. Brother Ling, we'll spar later, Faceless said with a smile. Ever since growing a face, his expressions had also started to become increasingly rich and lively. Sure, Ling Han said with a nod. Only after chattering for a while did Yang Lin and the others hover away on their floating rocks. Because they had all fought hard to reach this height, and because the teams at this height were all extremely powerful, no one was willing to rashly engage in battle with others. In fact, even Gu Dawi wouldn't dare to say that he could crush all of the elites at this height. Since their cultivation had been suppressed to the same level, the gap in power between them was also far too small. Those who dared to make an enemy of everyone would definitely be knocked down the quickest. However, there were also exceptions. More precisely, there was a dog that was an exception to this rule. The large black dog had also appeared, and he obviously hadn't formed a team with anyone who dared to form a team with him? To say nothing of being bitten in the rear by this dog, just the hostile stares from the tens of thousands of cultivators would be enough to pressure anyone to death. However, the battle style of the large black dog was surprisingly simple. He would simply crash into his opponents, this crash sure to knock his opponents off their floating rock. It was because of the large black dog's powerful physique and near immunity to origin power that he was able to take to this competition like fish took to water. Yet, his mouth was still as toxic as always. So be it if he defeated his opponents. However, he would still insist on biting and even mocking them, causing all of his opponents to explode in anger as they fell to the bottom of the valley. If they could fly up this valley, there would definitely be tens of thousands of people chasing after the large black dog at this moment. Sigh, my life is truly as lonely as fallen snow. It's truly cold at this great height. Grandpa Dog genuinely feels sorry for being so powerful. The large black dog was standing upright on his floating rock as he pretended to be the most powerful being in the world. Those people above, Grandpa Dog is coming. Come and become Grandpa Dog's human servants. His utterances instantly offended everyone in the valley. In fact, even Gu Dawi narrowed his eyes and moved his gaze away from Empress Luan Xing, stealing a few extra glances at the large black dog. He had lived 9 previous lives, and although each of these lives had only been very short apart from the first, these lives had still lasted for at least 1 million years. Yet, during these millions of years, he had never discovered anything special about the large black dog. After reincarnating into his 10th life, it was as if the large black dog had also obtained some great opportunity. This was so peculiar that even he was slightly astonished. However, this dog was an absolute C*NT. Gu Dawi would never allow a dog as depraved as this to follow him. He was someone who had the goal of breaking into the celestial realm and obtaining unparalleled power. If there were a dog continuously provoking the people around him, it would be a genuine miracle if he wasn't killed after a very short amount of time. After all, he wouldn't be an elite after entering the celestial realm anymore. Moreover, even though his divine fetus was extraordinary, just how powerful was the celestial realm? There would definitely be powerful physiques that could rival the incredible might of his divine fetus. As such, his physique could only be regarded as one of the most powerful, not the most powerful. Ignore that dog. Let us make haste and charge to the peak, Gu Dawi said. He cast his gaze to the giant golden boulder hovering in the sky. He had a feeling that if he could ascend this boulder, he would definitely obtain immeasurable benefits. To instill such a feeling in him, someone who was once a celestial, this boulder was definitely a goal that he had to reach. After a temporary moment of peace, intense battles immediately started to flare up again. A team of 12 aggressively charged toward Ling Han and the others, directly attacking them without even speaking a word. Nie Tiancheng and Shan Jingyi charged over to meet them. However, they were unable to suppress these people even after summoning their powerful weapons. Instead, they were the ones being ruthlessly suppressed. After all, their opponents were also extremely powerful, and they also had a huge advantage in numbers. This team of 12 wasn't a team that the two of them could deal with alone. The North Emperor and the Stone Emperor hurriedly rushed over to help. Even so, they were still unable to turn their disadvantage into an advantage. The Rain Emperor was itching to fight, so he roared loudly before also joining into the battle. Seeing the eager expressions on his two disciples' faces, Ling Han grinned before nodding in approval. Seeing this, Ding Ping and Jiu Yao also charged over to join the battle. Ding Ping represented pure power, and no one at the same cultivation level as him would be able to rival his strength. He launched a punch, and the dense power packed into this punch was at least 1 star more powerful than even rank 3 king tiers. Meanwhile, Jiu Yao was someone who had taken a path of peculiarity. The 9 divine patterns on his arms lit up, transforming into 9 powerful demonic beasts that were each just as powerful as him. When the 10 of them teamed up, it was equivalent to Jiu Yao gaining an extra star of battle prowess. At a glance, this didn't appear as powerful as Ding Ping. However, these 9 demonic beasts were all undying beings. Moreover, Jiu Yao's body could also transform into a mist-like state, his powerful defensive ability not something that Ding Ping could rival. Thus, when trying to determine which of them was stronger, this wasn't something that could be concluded from their power or cultivation level alone. However, when it came to the battles in the Sunken Abyss Valley, it was quite evident that the more powerful one's offensive ability, the greater their advantage. This was so because it would be extremely difficult to defend the floating rock beneath one's feet, regardless of how impressive one's defensive ability. Take, for example, Ling Han. He could stand there and allow every single king tier in this abyss to attack him. Even in the face of such attacks, he could guarantee that he wouldn't receive an iota of damage. However, he couldn't guarantee that the floating rock beneath his feet would also remain unscathed. The Rain Emperor was cultivating a path of dominance, so he hadn't even considered targeting the floating rocks beneath his opponent's feet. Instead, he simply attacked the cultivators. Once he defeated them, the floating rocks beneath their feet would naturally become his. This was obviously several times more difficult than just targeting the floating rocks. However, this was just how willful the Rain Emperor was. This greatly displeased Nie Tiancheng and Shan Jingyi. However, they had their hands full right now, so they didn't have any spare time or energy to express their displeasure. After a while, Su Ran and the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden also joined the battle. Meanwhile, taking into account his identity, the Notionless Saint didn't participate in the battle. After all, it was naturally beneath him to skirmish with these juniors. Beside him, Ling Han and Empress Luan Xing commanded the battle. If anyone was facing danger, they could also rush over to help. In any case, this was already sufficient. Although they were still at a disadvantage in terms of numbers, they were already more powerful than their opponents. The Rain Emperor was the first to achieve victory, blasting his opponent off his floating rock. Once this breach was opened, their remaining opponents started to fall like dominoes, either being knocked off their floating rock or having their floating rock shattered. However, even after defeating these powerful opponents, they only managed to rise by 9 meters. From this, it could be seen just how difficult it would be to cover the last 300 meters of the second stage. Not only did they have to defeat a few dozen people, but these would all be extremely powerful opponents. After all, these opponents would also be people who had crawled up by stepping on the corpses of others. Although the defeated cultivators could continue to rise up, there was only a mere 3 days of time. Thus, to reach the gigantic boulder in the sky would be a tremendously difficult task. In the countless years of this competition, no one had ever managed to ascend that gigantic golden boulder. This was a testimony of the immense difficulty of the task. Humph, how arrogant of you two! The others all participated in the battle, so why did you two stay behind to watch? After the battle, Nie Tiancheng immediately started to vent his anger on Ling Han and the Notionless Saint. Ding Ping and Jiu Yao immediately stepped forward, blocking Ling Han behind them. There was a menacing glint in their eyes as they faced off against Nie Tiancheng. Firstly, the battle has already been won. Secondly, does our master need to personally partake in such a battle? They asked in a haughty manner. Nie Tiancheng almost exploded in anger. Ling Han was far too arrogant. He was actually using his 2 disciples to deal with him. However, He could clearly tell that both of these disciples had only just advanced to the heaven body tier. In the outside world, he could easily suppress them using just a single hand. Here, however, even with his pseudo-saint tool, he still didn't have absolute confidence that he could defeat them. After all, he had witnessed their battle prowess just then. If he battled against them 2-on-1, he genuinely didn't have any confidence that he could win. Chapter 1447 Conclusion of the First Stage. Shan Jingyi arrived beside Nie Tiancheng at this moment, saying, "Couldn't we have ended the battle earlier if we all attacked at once? Don't forget, we're a team. The most important thing is the overall benefit of the team." Ding Ping and Jiu Yao wanted to retort him, yet Ling Han tapped their shoulders, saying, "Fine, we'll fight with the overall benefit of the team in mind next time. I'll also participate in the battle." Shan Jingyi and Nie Tiancheng exchanged a glance, delight in their eyes because of the imminent success of their plan. They wanted to target Ling Han, so they naturally needed to understand Ling Han's strength first. After all, one could only ascertain victory if they understood their opponent. Moreover, since his two disciples were already so powerful, could Ling Han be any weaker than them? Shan Jingyi and Nie Tiancheng didn't want to dig themselves into a hole. If Ling Han were too powerful, they would choose to bide their time first. Ling Han smiled faintly. He could easily guess the thoughts of Shan Jingyi and Nie Tiancheng. When they came across another team, Ling Han indeed participated in the battle. He casually snapped his fingers, sending a wave of sword qi toward his opponents. This could be viewed as a relatively powerful technique. However, in terms of extraordinary qualities, Ling Han didn't seem to show any. The notionless saint couldn't suppress his itch, so he also participated in the battle. However, he didn't unleash his saintly aura. This was his trump card, so he definitely wouldn't use it until the most critical moments. Only Empress Luan Xing didn't participate in any of the battles. However, she was a charming beauty they all adored and admired, so who would step forward to criticize her? 2,400 meters, 2,700 meters, 2,970 meters. At this height, there were already very few teams remaining, only 100 or so. Although there were only 30 meters remaining to the peak of the valley, theoretically speaking, only 5 to 6 of the teams would be able to ascend to this height during this round of battles. Everyone became even more alert and serious. Each of these 100 or so teams had risen up after defeating countless other teams. As such, which of these teams wasn't extremely powerful? If they were defeated by an even more powerful opponent, they would fall back down to the bottom of the valley. At that time, they would have to battle their way up again. Die! After a short pause, chaotic battles instantly broke out between the teams again. Meanwhile, Ling Han and the others finally came across a powerful opponent. Without Empress Luan Xing participating, and without Ling Han unleashing his full power, the skirmish between their teams lasted for several long hours before a victor was finally determined. They had defeated their opponents. Ling Han's team rose several more meters. However, glancing into the distance, Gu Daoi's two teams had already risen by many more meters. This was a sign of their overwhelming battle prowess. Meanwhile, at this moment, the teams of the Supreme King tiers finally separated themselves from the remaining King tiers. "Zi Chunfeng!" the North Emperor exclaimed as he gazed at a team of 7 in the distance. Among this team, there was a young man who surprisingly had flowing purple hair. There was also a pair of horns on his head, though it was difficult to tell what kind of horns these were. In any case, these horns didn't affect his handsomeness in the least. "I battled against him several thousand years ago. However, I was defeated in a single strike." Ling Han nodded upon hearing this, saying, "He's reached the pinnacle level of the heavenly body tier." If they were at the same cultivation level, no one could defeat the North Emperor in a single strike. "Long Xiangyue!" Nie Tiancheng exclaimed as he gazed at another location. His pupils contracted, and cold sweat surprisingly started to drip from his forehead. That was a woman who possessed an incredibly attractive figure. She was dressed in a suit of golden scale armor and also wearing a helmet that was decorated with dragons. Her luscious hair was tied into a bun inside this helmet, and even from this distance, they could feel the might and vigor radiating from her. She was more so exuding an astonishing vitality and liveliness. It was as if she were a true dragon in human form. Truly, her aura was far too astounding. Moreover, She was alone with her sword. She hadn't formed a team, nor did she have any followers. Her demeanor was one of independence and strength. Second in the world! Shan Jingyi exclaimed in astonishment. This was another rank 3 king tier who was standing at the peak of the current generation of prodigies. Ling Han glanced over. Second in the world definitely couldn't be regarded as a handsome man. However, he was extremely large in stature, being at least a head taller than most other people. He was sturdily built, and his skin was a tanned copper color. His arm was dense with hair, and his face was more so covered by a thick beard. At a glance, he genuinely looked like a powerful bear standing on its hind legs. Judging by appearance alone, this person didn't look anything like a powerful king tier. He looked neither ethereal nor full of wisdom and vigor. If he were placed on some random street, anyone would think that he was the thug of the town. However, contrary to expectations, it was someone like this who was a supreme king tier. The name second in the world was enough to explain everything. Second in the world wasn't alone, there was a team of people behind him. Unexpectedly, this was a team of elegant and graceful women. Moreover, they were all as beautiful as flowers. This was a jarring sight, and they didn't seem to fit together with second in the world at all. To say nothing of beautiful flowers being placed with cow dung, this was still at least a case of beauties and a beast. Why isn't Empress Luan Xing here? The Stone Emperor murmured to himself. He hadn't seen Empress Luan Xing before, and Ling Han and the others hadn't introduced her to him, either. Thus, he was still looking around in search of her. However, he couldn't find anyone who fitted the descriptions of the rumors. The North Emperor and Ye Tiancheng were also searching for her. However, like the Stone Emperor, they were also completely baffled. Little did they realize that Empress Luan Xing had been beside them this entire time. Xiao! Long Xiangyue was the first to move, charging toward a team of 12. Once she defeated them, she would obtain 12 floating rocks and immediately rise to the peak. Humph! So what if you're a rank 3 king tier? You're by yourself, so there's no chance that you'll win. The team of 12 immediately started to counterattack. They were all rank 2 king tiers, and they all possessed extremely powerful weapons. In fact, some of their weapons were no less valuable than Ye Tiancheng's Celestial Peach Branch or Shan Jingyi's replica 6 Elements Mountains. Long Xiangyue slashed with her sword. This strike had a celestial's elegance, exuding a profoundly ethereal aura. Moreover, she was incredibly domineering, directly charging at them head-on. Her suit of scale armor started to glow, and it was as if her helmet had also become alive. It transformed into a genuine dragon head, unleashing a tremendous dragon might as it roared. Even the Supreme King tiers could feel the boundless pressure exuding from this roar. True dragons, once they matured, they would already be Genesis tier saints. They possessed the most powerful bloodline in the immortal realm. With just her sword, Long Xiangyue was still tremendously powerful, her relentless attacks quickly causing her opponents to become wounded and disheveled. With an overwhelming might, she forcefully snatched the 12 floating rocks of her opponents. She then immediately rose upward, becoming the first person to reach the peak of the valley. The image of an hourglass instantly materialized on the gigantic golden boulder hovering above the valley. Moreover, the sand within it had already started to flow. Someone had finally broken through the first stage and charged into the second stage. However, Long Xiangyue was unable to rise any higher. This was because there was no one else at the same level as her. Even if she lowered her position by 6 meters and the others raised theirs by 6, that would still only make up 12 of the many meters between them. She could only wait. Meanwhile, the other teams also started to do battle. The countdown had already begun, so they could no longer take things slowly and steadily. Among the king tiers who had come here, who didn't yearn to ascend the giant golden boulder at the peak? Charge! After a series of intense battles, the teams that possessed Supreme King tiers all started to rise steadily, breaking through to the second stage one after another. Upon reaching this stage, each team would naturally disband. The cultivators could also see that as long as 2 people were together, the floating rocks beneath them would automatically begin to crumble. If they didn't engage in battle, their only fate would be to die together. That being the case, teaming up would be a near impossible task. Ye Tiancheng and Shan Jingyi exchanged a glance before both of them suddenly lashed out, striking at the floating rock beneath Ling Han's feet. It was for this moment that they had endured him for so long. They were already impatient to see the astonishment and shock on Ling Han's face. That would definitely be a beautiful sight to behold. However, Ling Han suddenly turned around, a strange smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Chapter 1448 10 Powerful King Tears. Nie Tiancheng's and Shan Jingyi's heart jolted. They had both launched a surprise attack, so logically speaking, Ling Han certainly shouldn't have been able to predict their attacks beforehand. Yet, in reality, Ling Han was composed and unflustered. Not only that, but he had even cracked a strange smile at them. This meant that he had already been wary of them for a long time. Good one, brat. As a member of the team, you were actually suspicious of your team members. It truly was absurd that this was the thought running through their minds. Perhaps they should have reflected on the fact that it was they who were attacking Ling Han right now. Ling Han's smile grew even wider as he swung both of his fists at once. Wang! A terrifying might swept outward, and the power of Nie Tiancheng and Shang Jingyi was forcefully suppressed by 2 stars. 2 stars. What kind of concept was this? They were all at the low extreme of the heavenly body tier, and they were all ranked 2 king tiers. Thus, even if there were discrepancies in their power, it would have only been extremely minimal. Right now, however, the power of Nie Tiancheng and Shang Jingyi had been suppressed by 2 entire stars. This was a drop of 100-fold. How could they still oppose Ling Han? Pang pang. They were instantly blasted off their respective floating rocks, screaming in agony as they flew through the air. However, this still wasn't the end. Empress Luan Xing also lashed out, 2 large mountains materializing as she made a slapping motion with her hand. Boom! These mountains ruthlessly slammed into Nie Tiancheng and Shang Jingyi. Pa pa! Blood instantly exploded from their bodies, the sound of breaking bones grating yet unending. In fact, this strike had broken all of the bones in their bodies. If Ling Han hadn't attacked them, or if he hadn't suppressed their power by 2 stars, their situation wouldn't have been so dire. Even if they were no match for a rank 3 king tier, it would have still been impossible for a rank 3 king tier to severely wound them with a single strike. Just then, however, Ling Han and Empress Luan Xing had essentially teamed up to attack them. How many people in the world could withstand their devastating attacks? At least, it was clear that Nie Tiancheng and Shang Jingyi couldn't. They continued to wail in agony as they plummeted to the floor of the valley. Ling Han blasting them off their floating rocks had only caused them some minor injuries. However, Empress Luan Xing's follow-up strike had genuinely left them with severe wounds. These wounds weren't severe enough to kill them, yet they were severe enough to ensure that they wouldn't be able to battle at full strength for at least several hundred years. Gazing at the proud and mighty Empress Luan Xing as they fell, they suddenly came to a realization. Fuck! Isn't she the king tier assassin? Sure enough, they had been mercilessly defeated. There were indescribable emotions churning in their minds at this moment. However, their envy and jealousy of Ling Han grew several-fold. After leaving this valley, they would definitely have their revenge on Ling Han. He had actually dared to lull them into a trap. Right now, 50 or so king tiers had already entered the second stage of the competition. At this height, it was already impossible to form any alliances. Each person could only fight for themselves. If they didn't want to battle against someone, the most they could do was avoid them or keep their distance. Ling Han and his companions also spread apart. After all, they naturally wouldn't step on the corpses of their friends to rise to the top. By spreading apart, they could avoid being forced into battle against each other. This would obviously result in some of them being defeated, but there was nothing more they could do about this. This was also the case for everyone else, with all the king tiers fighting their own battles after reaching the second stage. It was impossible to team up, and each person could only rely on their own abilities. In fact, this also rendered the competition more fair. Ling Han started to unleash his power as he engaged in battle. He didn't unleash his full power though, merely unleashing heaven's might to suppress the power of his opponents. However, in a competition such as this, the effect of heaven's might was incredibly devastating. It could almost be regarded as one of the most powerful weapons. Everyone's power was the same, yet if someone came across Ling Han, their power would be suppressed 100-fold. That being the case, how could they still rival him? Ling Han was as good as invincible as he defeated numerous opponents and continued to rise higher and higher. Meanwhile, less and less people could stay at the same height as him. It wasn't long before there were only 10 of them at the same height. There was Empress Luan Xing, the Rain Emperor, the Notionless Saint, Zi Chunfeng, Long Xiangyue, second in the world, Gu Daoyi, and Ling Han. Meanwhile, the last two individuals were complete strangers to Ling Han. However, like Ling Han, they had both been extremely low-key in the beginning. Only after entering the second stage did they suddenly transform into powerful individuals who obliterated anyone who stood in their way. The North Emperor and Stone Emperor hadn't been defeated yet, but a significant gap had already formed between them and the first echelon. As for Ding Ping, Jiu Yao, Su Ran, and the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden, they had also fallen into the second echelon of king tiers. Below them, there were still many more cultivators fighting and surging up. These were the cultivators who had been defeated after occupying spots in second and third echelons before. Right now, they were fighting their way up again. This is incredible. I've heard that those 4 are all from the same galaxy, someone said as they pointed at Ling Han, Empress Luan Xing, the Rain Emperor, and the Notionless Saint. They then pointed at the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden and the others, and said, "They're also from that same galaxy." A single galaxy produced 8 king tiers, all of whom are this powerful? Good heavens! The spectators at the bottom of the valley all clasped their heads in shock and surprise. This was an astounding revelation. A small galaxy had actually produced this many top-notch king tiers? How could those from the large and super-large galaxies accept this? However, the following battles will be what determines the final victor. I reckon Gu Daoyi has the best chance of winning. I've heard that his talent is unparalleled throughout both the past and the present. I agree. He's the only king tier who's been able to recruit fellow king tiers as followers. This is a clear sign that his strength is far superior to the other king tiers. I support Empress Luan Xing. There's no reason for this, other than that I like her. I also support Empress Luan Xing. Ha! Who are the other 2 people? I don't think I've ever seen them before. Heh, that's because you're uninformed. The person in gray is called Hong Ma, and he's the disciple of the Sky Ancient Saint. Moreover, he's a rank 3 king tier. What? Another rank 3 king tier? Hee, the person in blue is a lone cultivator, yet his fortune is astonishing, and he's come across countless rare opportunities in his time. His name is Cheng Xiaofan, and he's also a rank 3 king tier. Cheng Xiaofan isn't ordinary at all. Anyhow, I still think that Gu Daoyi is going to win. He's a prodigy who was born in accordance with the great trend of heaven and earth, so he's destined to become a brilliant prodigy whose dazzling radiance illuminates past, present, and future. Indeed. More and more people started to lean toward the opinion that Gu Daoyi would be the eventual victor. This was an extraordinary king tier who possessed an aura that resonated with the rhythm of Tao. Moreover, among the 10 most powerful king tiers, he was clearly the most eye-catching one. It was as if he were a sun, while the others could only scrape by as the stars that orbited him. The gulf between them appeared far too large to overcome. Above the valley, Gu Daoyi stood with his hands clasped behind his back. He smiled as he looked at Ling Han, saying in an incredibly haughty voice, "I never imagined that you would be powerful enough to reach this stage and even dare to oppose me." Ling Han naturally wouldn't back down, retorting, "You've merely come out of hiding after tens of thousands of years. Why would I be afraid of you?" Ha! Gu Daoyi couldn't help but chuckle, saying, "Prodigies have no option but to bow their heads before me. In fact, even king tiers are nothing more than dirt. Wherever I pass, all beings will have to prostrate." Boom! Before he could even finish speaking, a brilliant sword light had already slashed toward him. Ling Han brandished his sword, saying, "Prostrate your mom. Come battle me. I'll teach you how to become a decent human." Gu Daoyi couldn't help but grimace. Back then, Ling Han had provoked him with a few words, arousing his pride and resulting in his decision to let Ling Han go. After all, this was the first person that he had spoken to in hundreds of millions of years. Indeed, that had been quite a meaningful event for him. He wanted Ling Han to witness his rise to glory. However, he would have never imagined that Ling Han actually possessed such a toxic togue, one almost as toxic as that of the large black dog. However, Ling Han's strike was already before him, so he had no option but to engage. He struck using his palm. Pang! The sword light collided with his palm strike. Boom! The sword light was instantly shattered, transforming into a devastating shock wave that caused all of the surrounding floating rocks to sway violently as if they were ships out in the tumultuous sea. When this shock wave passed, the spectators could see that Ling Han was facing off against Gu Daoyi, raging fighting spirit on their faces. "I've truly underestimated you," Gu Daoyi said softly. "However, before me, all prodigies are nothing but tra." Shua! His words were cut off by another strike from Ling Han. "Fuck! Is there any end to this? Even if you want to fight, at least let me finish speaking first, okay?" Ling Han was really too foolish. He was actually showing off his courage at such a time. This was not merely an attempt to seek death anymore. He would be killed by his own foolishness. Boom! That attack of Ling Han, which seemed like a speck of dust, met the colossal finger, and it was visible that the giant finger was beginning to deteriorate at an astonishing pace. When it truly reached Ling Han's body, it had already collapsed on its own. What? Seeing this scene, everyone's mouths were gaping. They were rendered completely speechless. Previously, they had said that Gu Daoyi's attack was definitely not something that could be matched by anyone in the low extreme of the heavenly body tier, but just in the blink of an eye, Ling Han had used reality to slap their words back into their faces. He had easily dispersed the attack. So many years had passed, and Ling Han had continued to cultivate underneath the reincarnation tree. He had also drunk who knew how much reincarnation tea, and had boosted his mastery of the tide of the ages to a well-practiced extent. Even without the bloodline of the Ding clan, he had definitely surpassed a great majority of the members of the Ding clan in terms of his use of tide of the ages. Gu Daoyi also looked surprised. Though this finger had not been comprised of his full power, who was he? He was a prodigy of the celestial realm, and now he was also a divine fetus that had been produced from his 9 lives. The strength of his battle prowess should be invincible among his peers in the immortal realm. This is the power of time. He carefully recollected, and the look of surprise on his face involuntarily became even stronger. Though Ling Han's mastery of the power of time could only be considered superficial, an ant of the lower realm was actually capable of touching the height of the regulations of time. This was inconceivable in his eyes. Even in the celestial realm, aside from the inheritance of bloodline, only those that had advanced into the severing mundane were qualified to touch this kind of supremely high regulations. Could it be that Ling Han possessed the bloodline of the celestial realm, and had been expelled from the celestial realm just like him? That's right. Otherwise, how could he possibly know of the existence of the celestial realm? No wonder he dared to oppose him. As it turned out, he was also from the celestial realm. Humph, you just have a slightly superficial grasp of the power of time, and you dare think you can stop me? Gu Daoyi asked maliciously, disdain clear on his face, but a feeling of vigilance rose up in his heart. The power of time was extraordinary. In a battle between equals, he had to show his true abilities. Ling Han smiled calmly and said, "You've been asleep for several billion years, and you really have a lot of nonsense to spout." Gu Daoyi's expression darkened involuntarily. He really had a vicious tongue. He had cultivated to his 10th lifetime, so his way of thinking had also become young, and he was also more easily provoked. His eyes narrowed involuntarily, and his killing intent soared. "You are so determined to seek your own death." He maneuvered the floating rock and charged towards Ling Han. He tapped out another finger, the tip of his finger as bright as blood and incredibly blinding. God of Blood Finger. Ling Han still did the same thing, and sent out another tide of the ages. However, he immediately discovered that the might of the other's attack was incredibly dense, just as if it was a mountain that had been condensed into the size of an egg. Thus, the surface area that was being affected by the tide of the ages had also become very, very small. Hence, when this finger was endlessly having its outer shell peeled off, until there was only a small point left behind, the might of the tide of the ages had also completely vanished, yet this tiny point was bursting with the most frightening destructive power. Boom! This attack landed on Ling Han's body, and forced him backwards a few thousand meters, but when he arrived at the boundary of the valley, his figure stopped. An invisible barrier had stopped his retreat. Gu Dawei revealed an expression of pride. Did he think that he had no way to deal with this superficial level power of time? What a joke! He had grasped who knew how many powerful secret techniques, and they were all celestial realm level, so his support base was unimaginable strong. But in the next instant, the arrogance on his face suddenly transformed into surprise. That was because Ling Han had moved about his bones and muscles, looking like he had not been harmed in the slightest. If this attack had been aimed directly at the floating rock beneath his feet, Ling Han would definitely have fallen, but as it was an attack aimed at him, then how could power on the level of low extreme possibly cause him serious injury? Even if it was a technique from the celestial realm, it was still impossible. That was because the indestructible heaven scroll had similarly originated from the celestial realm, and its level was even higher. Chapter 1450 Saber of Heaven's Will. Gu Dawei was indescribably stunned. The God of Bloodfinger was an ultimate technique he had cultivated in his second lifetime. Used as an attack, with Ling Han's superficial mastery of the power of time, it was absolutely impossible for him to dispel the attack. This was indeed as he had expected, but could it be that this guy's body was forged from divine metal? Even Gu Dawei could not imagine how there could possibly be such a freakish physique in this world, causing him to involuntarily be stirred up emotionally and pale. Fuck, I must have seen it wrong, right? That brat suffered such a terrifying attack from Gu Dawei, and he didn't even have the slightest scratch on him? No, he has still been wounded. Bull*T, that's only a little bleeding from the corner of his mouth. Can that also be considered a wound? The masses below were all grabbing their heads. Gu Dawei couldn't cause him serious injury even when he used a supreme technique. What level had Ling Han's physique reached? Ling Han wiped away the trace of blood at the corner of his lips. He was Gu Dawei after all. Even if his cultivation level had been reduced, this attack had still induced a certain amount of damage to him. After all, the toughness of his physique had also been weakened along with his cultivation level. But this kind of wound was completely nothing. With a flick of his finger, innumerable flashes of sword chi danced, and struck out at Gu Dawei. Lightning sword technique. Shwa, shwa, shwa. Every flash of sword chi was incredibly and extraordinarily fast, and they caused Gu Dawei to suddenly cut a sorry figure. He parried endlessly, but after these flashes of sword chi dispersed, multiple rips had appeared on his clothing as well. Some of his hair had also been cut, and there was even a wound on his cheek, from which blood was seeping. Gu Dawei had also been injured. Seeing this scene, everyone couldn't help but gasp, and Gu Dawei's followers were incredibly furious. They wanted nothing more than to fly up into the air and grind Ling Han into dust. In their hearts, Gu Dawei was a god that could only be worshipped. That was Gu Dawei, the person who was acclaimed to be strongest prodigy for all eternity, but now in a situation when their cultivation levels were completely equal, he had actually sustained an injury. You attacked and I countered, neither willing to take a loss. Gasp, Ling Han was also very strong. At this moment, there was finally a number of people that leant towards Ling Han. Even if they did not think that he could win, he was qualified to oppose Gu Dawei at least, and was the strongest king tier of the present younger generation. Gu Dawei wiped his cheek. Ice blood congealed and did not change. Each drop was like a bead. He looked at the trace of blood on his hand, his expression becoming colder and colder. He had recultivated 8 lifetimes when he had fallen from the celestial realm into this immortal realm. He had successfully reached the peak of Genesis tier in every lifetime, and had not suffered the slightest setback. How many years had it been since the last time he had been injured? He had buried his body of 9 lifetimes, and only became a divine fetus in his 10th lifetime. Furthermore, he was cultivating a cultivation technique of the celestial realm, so no matter how he thought about it, he should have been invincible among his peers. Even in the celestial realm, he was still confident that only prodigies of the same cultivation level could match him at most, but if it was a matter of defeating him, that was an absolute impossibility. But as it happened, in this immortal realm that he thought of as a primitive plane, there appeared a person who could match him, and the other party had not even cultivated to his 3rd pinnacle level. In theory, in terms of power and the use of regulations, the latter was slightly less skilled than himself. Then didn't that completely mean that he would lose in a battle between equals? No. Gu Dawi looked once more at Ling Han, and communicated through his divine sense. I used my body of 9 lifetimes to cultivate the divine fetus of my 10th lifetime. I cultivated supreme mystical powers in every lifetime. How many mystical powers from how many lifetimes would you be capable of blocking? Bring it on. Ling Han laughed loudly. His hands flourished, and one after another, flashes of sword chi shot out and sliced towards Gu Dawi. He was also very conceited. Since Gu Dawi was not using any weapons, he also put the divine demon sword away. Heaven's will saber. Gu Dawi's expression suddenly became serious, his whole person exuding a cold saber intent as if he himself had become a supreme divine saber that could slash apart all in existence. Ling Han's face bore a smile, but a powerful feeling of alertness rose up in his heart. Those like Empress Luan Xing and Faceless, if they were traced back to their origins, were all related to the celestial realm. They were descendants of elites from the celestial realm, and the blood of the celestial realm flowed in their bodies, so they could use the techniques of the celestial realm. But compared to Gu Dawi, they were still far too inferior. He himself was an elite of the celestial realm. He had only buried himself and lived one lifetime after another. With every lifetime, he would change his bloodline once and cultivate a new mystical power. Though Ling Han was not sure about the theory, it was likely related to the 9 Deaths Heaven art. This was a living elite of the celestial realm. He had only had his cultivation level weakened, but his foundations were even deeper, and his constitution was incredibly strong. The secret techniques that he used definitely could not be underestimated. The truth was indeed so as well. A supreme divine saber appeared above Gu Dawi's head. It was 30,000 meters long and as black as ink. The mere sight of it would cause one's heart and soul to tremble as if their spirit itself would be plucked out of their body. Gu Dawi's Heaven's Will Saber meant that when the heavens delivered a saber strike on you, the damage was not done to the physical body, but rather to your spirit. All life fades. Gu Dawi pointed a finger at Ling Han. Shua, the divine saber slashed over, representing the great Tao of heaven and earth, and could not be blocked by anything in existence. Ling Han used the Tide of the Ages, but in a clash of celestial techniques, the Tide of the Ages was not able to produce much effect. This divine saber had only been weakened by 30%, and was still slashing down at him with its massive aura and might. This was very normal. Celestial techniques were invincible in the immortal realm, but in the celestial realm, there definitely would be innumerable ways of opposing them. Otherwise, wouldn't the Ding clan have been able to conquer and rule over the whole celestial realm? Boom, the saber struck down, and inconceivably, the saber's blade that was still over 20,000 meters long actually sliced into Ling Han's body, and then disappeared without a trace. This was not a material attack, but rather divine intent. It was naturally formless, and the damage was directly dealt to the spirit. Ha ha! Gu Dawi laughed loudly. After being slashed by the Heaven's Will saber, it was natural that not the slightest bit would be left of his spirit, as it would all be destroyed. From now onwards, there would no longer be a person called Ling Han in this world. He felt a slight pity. In his eyes, Ling Han should also be from the celestial realm. Even if he had not come directly from the celestial realm like himself, he should at least be a descendant of those that had been expelled from the celestial realm those years ago, and they could be claimed to share the same roots. If possible, he actually wanted very much to take Ling Han in under his banner as one of his followers to witness the supreme hegemony he would establish when he entered into the celestial realm one day. Because they were both exiles, this kind of acknowledgement would give him more pleasure. The others did not understand, however. How could such a powerful saber strike deliver such a tranquil attack? That is a saber that slices the spirit. It looks incredibly colossal, but actually has no true form. Naturally, it would not cause much of a commotion. A powerful figure spoke up to explain. That was a representative sent from the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy, an elite of Eternal River tier. When these words were said, everyone was stunned. It should be known that even in the immortal realm, most people were basically cultivating the strength of their physical body, and though they would still cultivate their spirit, it was only primarily in the direction of strengthening the latter so that the strength of one's spirit would keep up with one's cultivation level. However, they would not deliberately be cultivating the intensity thereof. Which also meant that if they had encountered Gu Dawi, it was possible that even if 100 of them joined forces, it would still be useless. When the Heaven's Will saber struck, all of them would become empty shells. Sigh, that guy is indeed very extraordinary as well, and he has actually been killed just like this. There is one less Supreme King tier. What a real pity. That's not right. If this guy had died, shouldn't the floating rock beneath his feet have been absorbed by Gu Daoyi? Someone suddenly exclaimed. Gasp. Everyone's eyes had widened, and they once again focused their eyes on Ling Han. Fuck, don't you tell them that this guy still hadn't died. Chapter 1451 Endless Mystical Powers. In front of everyone's eyes, a smile appeared on Ling Han's face, and he calmly said, So this is the Heavens Will Saber? Quite interesting. It makes my head ache a bit. Pooh. The audience spluttered in absolute disbelief. Though it was very rare to meet someone who had cultivated the art of spiritual attacks, it did not hinder their estimation of the strength of a spiritual attack. Gu Daoyi's Heavens Will Saber was close to 30,000 meters long, and merely seeing it from afar was enough to make one frightened stiff. This kind of attack was definitely incredibly terrifying. But after this saber struck, Ling Han actually just felt a little headache. Holy sh**t, not only is this guy's physique at the level of a freak, his spirit is also. Even though Supreme King tiers like Long Xiangyue and Zi Chenfeng looked cautious, they definitely did not want to encounter a guy with freakish defenses like Ling Han. If they really met such an opponent, then their target would be the floating rock beneath Ling Han's feet. They would definitely not attack him directly. They pondered that if it was in pure attack power, they were no match for Gu Daoyi. The sound of Gu Daoyi's laughter naturally came to an abrupt halt. The smile on his face disappeared, and he stared at Ling Han for a very long time before he finally said, Then take on the supreme mystical power that I cultivated in my 4th lifetime, roaring flames incinerate the heaven. Boom! Endless flames surged out of his body like an ocean. But the incredibly bizarre fact was that even though this ocean of flames could spread out in all directions endlessly, its upper and lower limit was restricted in an absolute 6 meters wide space. Which also meant that Gu Daoyi could not attack those more than 6 meters above from him, nor those more than 6 meters below him. This kind of flames was very frightening. Even Zi Chenfeng, second in the world, Hong Ma, and the others were not willing to be matched up against Gu Daoyi at this moment. They all quickly moved and grabbed a floating rock, increasing their altitude. In the midst of the fiery ocean, monsters appeared one after another. They were all formed from divine patterns and looked bizarre. Most of them were creatures Ling Han had never seen before. This was a celestial technique, so it was extremely possible that these monsters were beasts from the celestial realm. Ling Han broke into a smile though. It should be known that he had comprehended the profound mysteries of rising from the ashes amidst the immortal flames, and those were not ordinary immortal flames, either. They were the flames that the immortal phoenix burnt itself in. It was impossible for him to dispel the immortal flames, but it would be too easy for him to protect himself. He was already capable of becoming one with the immortal flame, and no matter how fiery the flames were, they would not be able to wound him. It was like he was bathing in the warm waters of a pond. He would only feel relaxed and comfortable, and would not be injured at all. He unfolded his origin power to protect the floating rock beneath his feet. Then, he aggressively charged towards Gu Daoyi. Fuck! Beneath them, everyone felt numb with shock. The mere sight of those flames would cause goosebumps. Who would not guard themselves with their utmost effort when being surrounded by those flames? That was because spreading out this ocean of flames would definitely expend a great amount of energy, so the best strategy was naturally choosing defense. When the other party was worn out, they could then counterattack. But what did Ling Han do? He charged out an attack when faced with these flames. They really did not know if they should call him courageous or stupid. No, it seems like he is really confident. My goodness, it seems like the flames can't wound him. Why do I have a feeling that these flames seem intimate to him? The flames released by an enemy can also feel intimate towards him? This guy must be a freak. A freak among freaks. Since it was the attack delivered by his opponent, then no matter how weak this attack was, they could only ignore it or dispel it. How could their opponent's attack actually feel intimate towards them? That was illogical. Even Gu Daoyi's eyes had widened his shock. He truly wanted to call him a freak. Ling Han arrived, and his fist shot out in attack. He did not have as many tricks as Gu Daoyi. Though it was a punch, what surged out was not the power of the fist, but rather endless sword intent. I am the sword. This was the enlightenment that Ling Han had attained from the attack delivered by the Heaven's Will Saber. Sword Dao did not need to be limited to the sword. Any kind of technique was merely formality. Only power and regulations were the fundamental qualities. Since that was the case, why would I have to care how this sword strike is delivered? He had a kind of enlightenment, and his sword intent had also become more solid as if it had undergone a kind of transformation. This time, Gu Daoyi was really stunned. You can even be enlightened in the midst of fuck battle? Wow! This brat's natural talent was beneath his, and so was his constitution. It could be claimed that all his inborn traits were inferior to himself, but his comprehension ability was too frightening, which caused him to feel cold. In the celestial realm, the lifespan of cultivators was unlimited. As long as they were not killed by the celestial decline, then they would have enough time to polish their origin power and perfect themselves. However, the only shortcoming they could not compensate for was the ability of comprehension. In other words, prodigies like himself only had a head start and had a fast dash in the beginning. They could very quickly leave the others behind. However, cultivation was not a short run, but rather an extended marathon whose end could not even be seen. After he had raced out a certain distance, he would slow down. That was because they were not competing in constitution or natural talent on this ultimate path, but rather in the comprehensive ability of the mysteries of heaven and earth. Those with higher comprehensive ability might start later, but would soon catch up, and even surpass those before them. This kind of person could not be left alive. Gu Daoyi's killing intent blazed. He could not allow rivals, or even those who would overtake him, to appear on his path of king tiers. Kill! Mystical power of the fifth life, skyward staff. He gave a battle cry. His origin power condensed, and formed a golden staff in his hands. He delivered a heavy strike at Ling Han. The ocean of flames, meanwhile, was withdrawn instantly. He did not have the capability to use two supreme mystical powers at the same time as of yet. Beneath them, everyone was already numb with shock. As expected of Gu Daoyi, every single secret technique he used was endlessly powerful. Others needed only grasp one of them, and they would be able to look down proudly on the rest of the world, but in his case, this seemed to be far from the end. Boom, when the skyward staff struck, it would shatter the heavens and earth. He was practically walking completely on the path of a tyrant. Without wasting words, one staff strike from him, and even the heaven and earth would collapse, and everything would be flattened. The Rain Emperor couldn't help but feel his hands itch. He really wanted to ask Ling Han to give way so he could go and fight to his heart's content. Ling Han also felt a noble aspiration, and declared, "This is what battle is." He raised his hand, and similarly gathered origin power, which took the form of a sword that greeted the skyward staff in attack. Boom! The sword and staff crashed into another, suddenly creating a frightening shock wave that swept out in all directions. However, the affected zone was restricted to the air within a diameter of 6 meters, and was not allowed to go farther than that. Ling Han's and Gu Daoyi's hair was fluttering, their clothing flapping loudly with the force, but neither of them took one step back in retreat. Even if Gu Daoyi was a rank 3 king tier, his cultivation level had been weakened, so he was not that much stronger than Ling Han. It could be considered a battle between equals. Pang! Pang! The two of them retreated at the same time, and with such a clash, the floating rocks beneath their feet had begun to dissolve. If the victor was still undecided after some more time passed, they would be considered to have ended the battle with mutual destruction, and both would fall down the valley. Chapter 1452 Light of Tao. Heavens, I would not be able to take on any of his mystical powers. This is what a true king tier is, capable of crushing all his peers. I now believe that Ling Han could really defeat Gu Daoyi. It would be quite difficult to do so, but it is very possible that the two of them would end with a tie. I still think Gu Daoyi is stronger. He obviously still has more secret techniques that he hasn't used, but Ling Han just keeps using that same sword technique. Don't tell me that you don't know that it is unwise to be greedy? Merely mastering one secret technique to the utmost is enough. What need would there be to waste time on other techniques? No matter what kind of opponent he encounters, it would be enough for him to kill them with a single strike. right? Humph, what's wrong with having a lot of secret techniques? He could choose which secret technique to use based on different environments and different opponents. This is called adapting to the conditions. Everyone began fiercely debating, and naturally, none of them were convinced of the opinions of the others. In the air, Ling Han's lightning sword technique had also begun a clash with Gu Daoi's flying flower sword technique. When the flying flower sword moved, there appeared dazzlingly beautiful flowers in the heaven and earth, but there was killing intent hidden among these exquisite blooms. When the flowers bloomed, divine swords shot out one after another in a brilliant display. Ling Han humphed. Lightning spread out, issuing punishment on behalf of the heavens. Boom, 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 boom. One after another, the flowers exploded, turning into dust. In a clash of sword techniques, the lightning sword technique was completely victorious. Gu Dao couldn't help but look livid. In a clash of sword techniques, this was a clash of sword Dao, especially when both of their sword techniques touched upon heavenly Dao. Thus, this had developed into a competition of the grade of their sword techniques, and it was obvious that the flying flower sword technique was completely defeated. Boom, lightning flashed all around them, turning into an ocean that barraged towards him. Gu Dao had no choice but to retreat and place all his focus on defenses. When the lightning had disappeared, though he was still standing proudly like a mountain, his hair was disheveled and clothes ripped, and he still revealed a sorry appearance. Gasp! In this clash, Ling Han completely has the upper hand. It is not just the upper hand. He has an overwhelming advantage. He has completely shattered Gu Daoi's sword technique. Sigh! The powerful figure from the Star San Martial Arts Academy said, "Both of them are extraordinarily talented." The competition of sword techniques just now had developed to the extent of sword Dao. Otherwise, even if Gu Dao had not been his match, he could not have possibly looked so pitiful now. The level of sword Dao? A great many people were confused, and humbly voiced their question. Putting all other factors aside, the competition is in terms of the height of sword Dao. Whoever is slightly superior would emerge with an absolute victory, and the losing side will only crumble completely, the mighty figure explained. Oh! Realization dawned on everyone. No wonder Gu Dao looked so pitiful. That was because he had lost in the clash of sword Dao. It could be considered that he had delivered the sword strike just now for nothing, only dissipating this attack from Ling Han, so he was naturally very strained. This had no relation to Gu Daoi's own abilities. It was purely that the sword technique he cultivated was no match for the other sword technique. I really never thought that a battle between two mere heavenly body tiers would actually advance to the level of sword Dao, the powerful figure mused ruefully. Though cultivators had always been pursuing the Dao of heaven and earth, those that had really grasped the essence of Dao would have already reached the Genesis tier. If one was to compare himself to another, he'd just die from ire. When everyone heard this, they were even more shocked. They were all in the heavenly body tier, but how far behind had they been left by Gu Dao and Ling Han? Gu Dao tidied his appearance. He was a supreme king tier, so he naturally could not forget his bearing. He frowned slightly. He had actually lost to Ling Han in terms of sword Dao. This was astonishing to him. It should be known that the flying flower sword technique was a celestial technique, and yet it was no match for Ling Han, which was proof that the sword technique Ling Han had grasped had attained what kind of level. If he knew that this was a sword technique that Ling Han had invented by himself, his mouth would definitely twist in absolute shock. It was not uncommon to create one's own technique, but to be able to reach the level of Dao, and more so completely defeat the flying flower sword technique with it, this was shocking. Even in the celestial realm, this was not something that any random elite could do. His killing intent burned even brighter. If he had only seen Ling Han as a mere ant in the past, now he had no choice but to consider him as a thorn in his side that he had to remove. The fortune of the heaven and earth was a very mysterious entity. He had buried his body of 9 lives, and emerged as a divine fetus in this lifetime, yet he had encountered Ling Han. This was a destined battle between himself and Ling Han. The two of them. Only one of them could win, and the loser would be abandoned by the heaven and earth, while all the fortune would be transferred onto the victor. He was sure of this fact. Thus he had to win. From this moment onwards, every battle between the two of them meant that they were snatching the fortune from the other, right until one of them collapsed. Mystical power of the 7th lifetime, 9 winds kick. Gu Dao said internally. He kicked out his leg. Shwa, 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 endless blades of Tao swept out, forming divine patterns that sliced towards Ling Han. With a flick of his finger, Ling Han was still using the lightning sword technique. Aside from the tide of the ages, this was his strongest technique at the moment. Moreover, this was his self-invented technique, and as his comprehension of the Tao of heaven and earth became deeper, its might would become even stronger. One day, it would not be strange for this technique to surpass tide of the ages. Why does it have to surpass the tide of the ages? Enlightenment rose up in Ling Han once more. Why could he not infuse tide of the ages into the lightning sword technique? His sword technique would bring with it the power of time, and crumble the attack and defenses of his opponent. One strike would attack his opponent's body, or even cause him to age. A bright luster that was out of this world exuded from him. Light of Tao. That powerful figure of the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy was dumbfounded, and looked as if he had seen a ghost. He murmured, "Only those that had created a supreme cultivation technique could be acknowledged by the heaven and earth and be enshrouded by the light of Tao. This is inconceivable. Could it be that he has invented his own sword technique? Otherwise, how could he possibly be enshrouded by the light of Tao? Light of Tao. A self-created sword technique that had gained the acknowledgement of heaven and earth. Gods. When the others heard this mighty figure's murmur, they all involuntarily became numb with shock. They could only feel disbelief as they broke out into a cold sweat. What kind of prodigy was this? Gods. Ling Han began to attempt infusing the tide of the ages into the lightning sword technique. As his attack unfolded, the power of time wafted out. Though its might was still very weak, it was already a very good start. Gu Daoui returned once more with failure. In truth, this was very normal. Though he had grasped many secret techniques, he could not use more than one at a time. In that case, what was the difference between one secret technique and 100? No matter how much he switched secret techniques, their might was about the same. Mystical power of the eighth life, 100 ghosts cloud heavens. Boom, endless darkness was released from within Gu Daoi's body, but it similarly could only extend about 6 meters upwards and downwards, appearing extremely bizarre. Amidst the darkness, ghoulish creatures appeared one after another. They were obviously as tall as 300 meters, yet were forced to shrink into an area of 6 meters, so all of them were crouching. Initially, these ghoulish creatures were very frightening, hideous and terrifying, but now all of them were crouching, and they appeared to be very hilarious, causing a great many people to break out into laughter uncontrollably. Gu Daoui, meanwhile, appeared very embarrassed. With a point of his finger, these ghoulish creatures suddenly shrank in size, and became only about 3 meters tall. Only then were they able to stand upright. However, in this way, these ghoulish creatures finally exuded the frightening aura that they should have. An evil air was exuding from them, causing everyone to shiver just from seeing them. This is a technique of the netherworld. It's too evil, it's filled with destruction. How did Gu Daoui learn a technique of the netherworld? Chapter 1453 Mystical Powers of the 10th Lifetime. Gu Daoui. His constitution was extraordinary, and he was born with Tao as if he was the beloved child of the heaven and earth themselves. Was it possible that such a person was a being of the netherworld? It was absolutely impossible. But if he was not a being of the netherworld, how could he possibly use a technique from the netherworld? The regulations of both realms were completely incompatible. Grasping the techniques of one realm would mean that he would be completely supplanted by the other realm. No one could possibly get the best of both worlds. Everyone was stunned. Previously, though the techniques that Gu Daoui had shown were all different in form, all of them had shown brilliantly, and were immediately identified as techniques of the immortal realm. Grasping the techniques of both realms at the same time. Gasp. No wonder this person could become the strongest king tier. Just ask the world, was there a second person that could simultaneously grasp the techniques of the two realms? Ling Han was unmoved. If one wanted to barge into the celestial realm, the prerequisite was to simultaneously grasp the regulations of both creation and destruction. Since Gu Daoui originated from the celestial realm, then what was so strange about him being capable of grasping the techniques of both realms? The darkness filled the skies. Though it only managed to enshroud a zone of 3 meters upwards and downwards, in this zone, it was completely dark, with all kinds of demons hidden in the shadows. Ling Han humphed and exclaimed, "Demons and monsters, disperse!" He released the brilliance of lightning. Crackle and boom, and all the ghouls were shattered to pieces. This move appeared to be extremely powerful, but in truth, it only seemed that way. That was no fault of Gu Dawi, because this place was the immortal realm. If he used a technique of the netherworld here, not only would it not be boosted by the heaven and earth here, it would be weakened instead. Added with the fact that the power of lightning was a specific weakness of evil beasts, the technique was naturally even more useless. This. Everyone's lips twitched. Though Gu Dawi's moves were endless, not one of them was effective. Ling Han had dealt with all of them with the same move every single time, using the same technique to deal with any change in technique. Mystical power of the 9th life, 8 doors. Gu Dawi switched techniques again. He pointed a finger at Ling Han, and multiple doors appeared around him. There were a total of 8, and each door was exuding light of a different color. They were slowly orbiting, each releasing a different aura. Kill! Gu Dawi flipped his hand over, and the 8 doors opened widely. Endless killing intent rushed out, intending to kill Ling Han. Formation technique. Ling Han was involuntarily surprised. Gu Dawi had really gotten into contact with many fields, and had an extremely great achievement in the field of formation techniques as well. However, he was unafraid. You were only endlessly switching techniques, but had not increased the might of any one of your techniques, so what was the use of switching over and over again? Hold on, was Gu Dawi someone so stupid? Ling Han's heart suddenly jolted. He had to keep his guard up. Ling Han delivered a sword strike, and peace returned to the world. Mystical power of the 1st life. Dazzle the heavens. Gu Dawi seemed to be completely indifferent. He was here to show off his ultimate techniques. His whole person had become a god of light, and was 100 times brighter than even the sun. He pressed down a palm, and boom, he would purify all. This was the mystical power from his 1st life. It was also the lifetime in which he had lived the longest. He had cultivated this lifetime in the celestial realm, so this attack was obviously stronger than the previous 8 secret techniques, causing even Ling Han to frown. Ling Han released a battle cry. The sword slashed out. The tide of the ages had fused with the lightning sword technique in a considerably complete way. True enough, battle was the best way to improve oneself. Without the pressure exerted by Gu Dawi, even with the reincarnation tree, Ling Han possibly would have to spend a few hundred years' time to be able to reach the level he was now. Boom! After the attack, both Gu Dawi and Ling Han were sent backwards simultaneously. However, it was still difficult to decide the victor between the two of them. Yet Gu Dawi broke into a strange grin. You must be very curious. It is obvious that these techniques could not possibly be effective, but why have I used each and every one of them? Hee hee, what you are thinking with your behind, how could I possibly know? Ling Han countered smilingly. Gu Dawi instantly burst into fury. Thinking with his behind. A muscle twitched in his cheek. He forcibly suppressed his anger and said, "That is because all this is for the sake of cultivating the mystical power of my 10th lifetime." He communicated all this through his divine sense. He did not want others to know of his strongest trump card. Mystical power of 10 lives, 9 lives fuse as one. Gu Dawi's figure shook, and another figure actually walked out of his body. Then, with another shake, a second figure appeared, then the 3rd, the 4th, and all the way until the 9th. Added with his main body, there were a total of 10 figures. These were the bodies from his 10 lives. He had summoned all 9 lifetimes through the mystical power of his 10th lifetime. 10 figures that all looked completely different. Thankfully, they were still influenced by Gu Dawi's own cultivation level. These 9 people had the same cultivation level as himself. Otherwise, if he summoned out 9 saints, who would be able to stop him in this world? But this was already scary enough. The mystical powers each of the 9 lifetimes had grasped were all incredibly powerful, and now that all the bodies of his 9 lives had appeared together, what did that mean? These mystical powers could be used at the same time. Beneath them, everyone was watching dumbfounded. One was no match for the other, so he summoned 9 copies of himself to fight together. Who could match that? Die! Gu Dawi roared loudly. His 9 doppelgangers shouted as well, and they all channeled their respective mystical powers: the god of Bloodfinger, Heaven's Will Saber, Skyward Staff, 100 demons in the night, and so on, and they all blasted at Ling Han. With all 10 lifetimes in the battle, who could match him in this world? Zi Chunfeng frowned, Hongma frowned, and the second in the world frowned. Only the Rain Emperor revealed an excited fighting spirit. When he encountered a strong opponent, he would become stronger. He completely disregarded the outcome of the battle. Meanwhile, Empress Luan Xing's delicate figure trembled lightly. This was a technique that had evolved from the 9 Deaths Heaven art, just like how she could create 9 doppelgangers. Gu Daoyi, though, had lived 9 lives. They were 2 different paths, but they could be merged and let her become stronger. Of course, this was also the same for Gu Daoyi. If he could create 9 doppelgangers, he would naturally be even more terrifying. When endless secret techniques attacked him, how was Ling Han supposed to block them? Ling Han could still deal with 1, or even 2, but 9? No matter how he thought about it, it was an impossible feat. Ling Han broke into a calm smile. With a flick of his right hand, he had tossed out the divine demon sword, which sliced out towards Gu Daoyi. Gu Daoyi was completely fearless. He was using all his 10 lives, and this was his strongest condition. In a battle of equals, no one could match him. His main body stretched out a hand to grab the divine demon sword. With his insight, he naturally could tell the extraordinary nature of this sword, and he was instantly filled with a desire to take it for his own. However, his hand had just stretched out when he saw the divine demon sword descend. It was actually slashing out in the direction of beneath his feet. Had the trajectory been calculated wrong by him? However, he immediately understood. The divine demon sword slashed through the weak defense and struck the floating rock. With how overbearing the divine sword was, the floating rock was instantly shattered. Fuck you! Gu Daoyi released a roar filled with grievance and fury. Boom! His figure rapidly fell. For elites, prodigies, and king tiers like himself, he should not take to heart any kind of empty honor. That was because he was already standing at the peak of this world. However, this action from Ling Han was really too underhanded, and even he couldn't help but forget himself and curse. It was clear how infuriated he was. He had been completely screwed over. Chapter 1454. Enraged Gu Daoyi. When Gu Daoyi's main body dropped, naturally, so did the bodies of his 9 lives. Just when it seemed like their attacks were about to reach Ling Han, they all dropped. The threat was naturally resolved on its own. When they saw this scene, everyone felt much sympathy for Gu Daoyi. If it was them, they too would want to throw curses. Who said Ling Han only knew one move and kept using the same move over and over again? He used another move, and see, Gu Daoyi was defeated in an instant. If Ling Han had used this move right from the start, everyone would definitely feel very disdainful, and think that he had used a cheap trick. However, Ling Han had battled fiercely with Gu Daoyi first, and displayed his strong abilities to the public. Thus, though this was an extremely cheap trick, everyone would only be impressed by his quick wits. Someone who was stubborn and only knew to battle to death. Could that really be considered a king tier as well? That was more like a brash fool. Ha ha ha, I never thought that it would end like this. Why do I feel a little bit of déjà vu? That large black dog. Ling Han's style is really a little like the large black dogs. Those that trifle with him would definitely feel incredibly depressed at the end. When they thought of that, loud laughter was heard from beneath. Upon closer thought, this was indeed quite amusing. Gu Daoyi accumulated his power step by step, and just when it looked like he was going to release his strongest ultimate move, he was screwed in an instant. They were uncontrollably amused by the great contrast. Pang! Gu Daoyi fell right down to the valley floor, causing the dust on the ground to fly. Under the special regulations in this sunken abyss valley, even heavenly body tiers were incapable of flight. He immediately got back to his feet, and released a roar filled with killing intent and fury. This fall was definitely the greatest humiliation in his life. Though it was only a fall of 3,000 meters, and had only taken the time of over a dozen breaths, as he fell, he could clearly see the mocking expression on the face of everyone on each level. This caused him to flush bright red, and he almost exploded. He had never experienced such great humiliation. It was practically comparable to how he had been cast out of the celestial realm. "I will kill you," he uttered word by word, his black locks soaring skywards. He had gone mad with rage. He grabbed another floating rock, and charged all the way up at an astonishing speed. All the elites presently would definitely be on the upper levels. So who could stop him in the lower levels? Even if they joined forces, it was useless. In the face of the Supreme King tier, what could a mere dozen people do? Ling Han, on the other hand, was ascending at a much slower rate. That was because those fighting him were all the top elites of the current generation. If he wanted to win, it was difficult. And even if he could win, he would need to spend an extremely long time for it. Because there were too few people above, every step upwards was also extremely difficult. Those Supreme King tiers were unwilling to begin a battle easily, either, and thus everyone was waiting. They were waiting for those below to ascend. Then, they would naturally have stepping stones to go upwards even further. The battle among them would be left for the last, commencing the moment when they reached the golden floating rock. Otherwise, there was completely no need for them to begin a battle at this time. As long as everyone maintained their position at the same height, they naturally would be able to obtain the same fortune blessing by the heaven and earth. What need was there for a battle to the death? Ling Han. Gu Daoi's speed was extremely fast, charging all the way from the bottom. Now the steps were formed. Empress Luan Xing moved, her hand holding a brick, and her fighting spirit burning. This strike actually came to an abrupt half. What? When they saw this move, all the people below them exploded into a commotion. That was a strike filled with the ire of Gu Dao, yet had actually been stopped forcibly, proving that the abilities of person who had moved were not beneath Gu Dao. Who was this again? So powerful. They looked towards Empress Luan Xing. Though there was a layer of cloth in the way of their sight, everyone could discover that tempting bearing. This was a beauty that could enchant others without even needing to reveal her true appearance. "You dare stop me?" Gu Dao asked harshly. His whole body was exuding killing intent and aggression. In this moment, he would kill whoever dared stop him. "Can't I?" Empress Luan Xing smirked. "How insolent, who do you think you are?" Gu Dao gave a start. He had really never thought that this woman was even more arrogant and overbearing than he was. She was but a mere woman, so how could she possibly be so bold? He felt that he was really starting to like this woman. However, she had also cultivated the 9 Deaths Heaven art, so it was destined that he would swallow her physical body. He could not possibly make her his own, so in his eyes, no matter how beautiful she was, or how enchanting her charms were, she was only a tool to improve his own abilities. How could he possibly like a tool? Die! He shot out a finger. This was the god of blood finger. Empress Luan Xing waved a hand, and greeted the incoming attack with her brick. The finger tapped, yet nothing happened at all. The might of this finger had been completely absorbed by the brick. The absolute beginning stone, evolved from the chaos source rock, the stone of origin created at the beginning of heaven and earth, could absorb all attack beneath the Genesis tier. Though its might was also limited now, it still had an unpredictable might. At least, the might of the god of Bloodfinger was still inadequate. Perhaps he would have to use the mystical power of 10 lives, and combine all the secret techniques of his 9 lives to be capable of breaking through the limits of the absolute beginning stone. The problem now was, he was unable to directly use the mystical power of 10 lives. He had to use the secret techniques from the 9 lifetimes first, and only then would he be able to use the supreme secret technique of his 10th lifetime. "You are not qualified to stand in the way of my husband's path of ascension to the heavens," Empress Luan Xing uttered proudly. She looked down arrogantly as she pointed at Gu Dao like she was an empress rebuking a subject that dared disrespect her. For Ling Han's sake, she would stand in the way of any elite that could pose a threat. The tenderness of the empress would only bloom for one man. Gu Daoi's expression was livid. He did not think that Empress Luan Xing could stop him, but the fact that a woman whose abilities were practically enough to match his own would go so far for a man actually made him feel jealous. "If you stop me, you will be seeking your own death," he threatened menacingly. "In your dreams," Empress Luan Xing uttered coldly. At present, everyone's cultivation level was equal, and when the restriction was released, both of their cultivation levels were equal as well. Thus, she would definitely be battling Gu Daoyi. The both of them had cultivated the 9 Deaths Heaven art, and it was destined that one would be paving the way for the other. Thus, she definitely had to win. This was a duel to the death that could not be avoided. Gu Daoyi did not respond further, the flames of his fury burning ever bright. Only one person between himself and Empress Luanxing could survive, but this was obviously not a good place to engage in a duel to the death. As long as the floating rock shattered, they would naturally leave the battle. Furthermore, his target was the gold floating rock at the apex. That place should contain a great fated opportunity for him. Damn! His fighting spirit bubbled. He decided to defeat Empress Luanxing as soon as possible, and then catch up to Luanxing so he would be the first to reach the golden floating rock. Mystical power of the first life. Mystical power of the second life. Mystical power of 10 lives. Gu Daoyi put his full effort into the battle, and after accumulating energy for a while, all 10 lifetimes appeared once more. Chapter 1455 The Last Sprint. Gu Daoyi fought fiercely with Empress Luanxing. At present, the two of them were in the same cultivation level, and there was not much of a gap in their true cultivation levels either. Furthermore, both had cultivated the 9 Deaths Heaven art, so they absolutely could be claimed to be true rivals. Even if Gu Daoyi had cultivated a divine fetus, and could summon the bodies of his 9 lives to aid him, Empress Luanxing still ruled the battle with the brick in her hand. This was the absolute beginning stone that could absorb all energy. Its upper limit extended to the Genesis tier, and even if its effects had been weakened in this place, it was still extremely overbearing, and was enough to help the Empress oppose Gu Daoyi. If he could not defeat the Empress, Gu Daoyi would not be able to get hold of the floating rock. If he could not get hold of the floating rock, he would not be able to ascend further, causing him to incredibly furious. He continuously released low growls, but Empress Luanxing looked down on him proudly, suppressing him firmly, and there was nothing he could do about it. Ling Han relaxed. He looked upwards, and the several Supreme King tiers were currently revising their positions, waiting for the last barrage. It was still not the time to move. Ling Han shook his head internally. That was because even if he snatched the floating rocks of all these king tiers, it would not be enough to let him rise to the height of the golden floating rock. He had to wait for even more people to come up from below to become his supply of stepping stones. This was very fast. A complete flight of stairs had formed below them. Those with strong abilities could charge up directly. There was no need to wait. There were more and more people entering the second stage, from a few dozen to over 100, then to a few hundred, more than 1,000, then more than 10,000. 100 flowers competed in brilliance this time round. The numbers of the prodigious king tiers this time had far exceeded any previous time. Thus, there were also more and more people who qualified for the second stage, leading to fierce battles. Ling Han, Zi Chenfeng, Long Xiangyue, and the others moved respectively, and continued to increase their own altitude. Phew! After rising another few meters upwards, a powerful gust of wind suddenly started up in the skies. Even Ling Han and the others felt as if their feet were light and airy, as if they were going to be blown away at any moment. But if they left their floating rocks, they would fall to the bottom of the valley, which was equivalent to starting again from the very beginning. Hurriedly, they channeled their origin power to oppose this wind. Even so, their feet were still unsteady, and they managed to maintain their balance with great difficulty. Some people had just charged up to this level, and with a gust of wind, they directly fell to the bottom of the valley with a sharp cry. Now, there was merely over a dozen people who could maintain their positions on this level, but there was still a distance of 30 meters to the golden floating rock at the summit. This appeared to be very close, but going by the calculation that a floating rock would allow an increase of height of 6 meters, if one wanted to form a flight of stairs, allowing one person to ascend to the apex, this needed 32 floating rocks, which also meant 32 king tiers that could maintain their positions on this level. This was too difficult. No wonder not one person had managed to land on the golden floating rock in all these years. That was because there were too few Supreme King tiers, and when they entered into the stage for the last sprint, there was no opponent that could allow them to rise further. But it was not that there was completely no hope for over a dozen people. That was because those that had been previously defeated could charge back up. If they could ascend to the summit, they would definitely be unwilling to stand as equals with another. After a short pause, a battle royale immediately began. Ling Han did not hold his punches either. With the movement of both his hands, the lightning sword technique was used continuously. Multiple flashes of sword light surged out from his body. His understanding of sword chi had once again experienced a breakthrough. I myself am the sword, so what need is there for me to be so insistent on the form? Every move I make would be a sword strike, even my hair could release sword chi, and the tide of the ages had also been integrated into the lightning sword technique. As he became more and more experienced in the assimilation of the two, his battle prowess also became stronger and stronger. My strength can only exceed 6 stars, but how many stars could my present battle prowess exceed? Even Ling Han did not know the answer. That was because his opponents were also supreme king tiers who could battle others stronger than themselves, so there was no accurate figure, which caused his estimation of his own battle prowess to be inaccurate as well. But that was fine. What he wanted were not figures, but to be invincible. Fight, fight, fight. He gave a battle cry, and charged into the masses, provoking others wherever he went like a demon king. Others would be fighting one-on-one, but he was completely uncaring. He made a move on anyone he saw, looking completely like he was aiming to become the public enemy. And indeed, because he had attracted enough animosity, very soon, for pairs of king tiers that were fighting stopped, and then attacked him simultaneously. There were a total of 8 supreme king tiers, who, one after another, god tools showed their might. Some were even in the level of the Eternal River tier, and had even reached the height of Pseudo-Saint Tool. However, they were suppressed by the conditions of this place. Still, their might exceeded the high extreme of Heavenly Body tier, and was definitely not something that could be blocked by someone in the early stage of the low extreme. What more when there were a total of 8 such king tiers? Ling Han was unafraid. Since he dared to trifle with them, he had considerable confidence in himself. Using the star-plucking step, he steered the floating rock beneath his feet with movements like a ghost's. Finally, he drew the divine demon sword. With a sword strike, even the heaven and earth would pale in color. Though it was said that sword Tao had no need to be insistent on its form, and as long as the sword was in your heart, all objects could be used like a sword, this did not mean that the might released would be the same no matter what object was being used. Speaking in fundamental terms, the divine demon sword was actually even more powerful than Ling Han himself. Its level had far suppressed Ling Han's own. Celestial light bloomed, and divine might was invincible. What depressed these king tiers even further was that Ling Han was aiming directly for the floating rocks beneath their feet. The ability of the divine demon sword to penetrate through defenses was definitely the strongest, at least in the immortal realm. The defense of origin power they had put up was practically an empty display. As long as it was struck directly by the divine demon sword, the only result would be that the defense would be completely shattered. They all released furious roars as their figures fell, yet all of their expressions were serious and grim. They definitely could not get too close if they fought with Ling Han. Otherwise, when that sword struck, nothing could stop it in its path. Now it was the floating rock, but in the future it could be their own bodies. It was too sharp and too overbearing. Could it be a saint tool that had achieved great accomplishment? Otherwise, how could it possess such terrifying might? Ling Han ascended. 6 meters, 12 meters, 18 meters. When there was still a gap of 12 meters, he stopped again. There were no longer any opponents in his surroundings. If no one managed to charge up here, he could only sit here. Even if he got first place, it would still be impossible for him to stand on that golden floating rock. That was why, though a great many stunningly talented and bright prodigies had appeared in all these generations, without powerful enough competitors, they could only look down on the smaller mountains below them, and feel lonely at the top. Ling Han was filled with anticipation. Could anyone among such rank 3 king tiers like the second in the world, Zichen Feng, and Long Xiangyue charge up here and lend him a helping hand? Get lost! Long Xiangyue was the first to arrive. She held a divine sword in her grasp, and the armor on her had become a coiled true dragon, exuding a frightening dragon's might. Even against rank 3 king tiers, this would exert great pressure. This was also an important reason that led to her being the second to charge up here. Her black locks fluttered, her skin as lustrous as jade and actually glowing, making her seem like a goddess, a goddess of war, one who could stun the 9 heavens with a single strike from her sword. The target she was aiming for was actually also the floating rock beneath Ling Han's feet. Who said that King Tears definitely had to battle upright and frank? Chapter 1456 Borrowing a Dragon Horn. King Tears liked to battle, yet this was simply because they yearned to prove their strength. In this valley, the most important task was obviously to reach the gigantic golden boulder that hovered above the valley. Doing so would also be the best method to prove one's strength. Ever since this valley had come into existence, there had always been someone who had achieved first place. However, none of the victors had ever managed to ascend the gigantic golden boulder. Ascending this boulder would be writing a new page into history. Perhaps doing so would also allow the victor to write a glorious new chapter that belonged to themselves. The King Tears were all firm believers of luck and fortune. There existed an intangible will of heaven, and each generation would see the birth of its own leader, someone who would lead the might of heaven and earth and rule over the entire generation. In this area of the universe, the ruler was currently the Star Sand Saint. Although he wasn't a Saint King, he was peerless and invincible throughout all of the surrounding galaxies, and his status and influence were as if he were an actual Saint King. Now that they were ushering in a golden age of cultivation, where prodigies were appearing all over the place, the role of luck and fortune was becoming even more important. Which of these supreme King Tears wasn't a top-notch prodigy? In fact, there was even someone like Gu Daoui, a prodigy who possessed a divine fetus. However, among them, only one could emerge as the victor who eventually occupied the throne and ruled over the world. How could one break away from the pack and ascend this throne? Through luck and fortune. The victor would see their fortune rise, while the losers would see their fortune wane. This was an intangible process, yet its effects would become increasingly obvious with the passage of time. One who possessed great fortune would meet no resistance when entering ancient sites, also being able to obtain rare treasures. Meanwhile, those who possessed waning fortunes would come across perilous dangers with every step, and yet still fail to find any worthwhile treasures. As this effect showed itself over time, the gap between the King Tears would naturally grow larger and larger. Thus, even though ascending the gigantic golden boulder might not bring them any extra benefits, Ling Han, Long Xiangyue, and the others all unleashed their full power to surge toward it. If they defeated all of the fellow King Tears of their generation, they would be crowned as the victor and the king. This was a battle over fortune. In order to achieve victory, they would naturally unleash all of their trump cards. Long Xiangyue slashed with her sword at Ling Han, sword light soaring into the sky as countless divine patterns blossomed. In fact, there were even the roars of dragons reverberating through heaven and earth. This was an astonishing attack. Ling Han unleashed the tide of the ages, easily blocking her strike. Apart from the secret techniques of celestial King Tears like Gu Daoui, there were few immortal realm secret techniques that the Tide of the Ages couldn't deal with. The Tide of the Ages would only struggle if its opponent were a descendant of an ancient tribe and also possessed the bloodline of the celestial realm. If one's celestial bloodline were extremely pure, the celestial techniques that they could wield would naturally be incredibly mighty as well. The attack that was targeting Ling Hanet was actually targeting the gigantic golden boulder. To be more precise, was instantly aged. Meanwhile, Ling Han possessed a freakish physique, so he genuinely didn't care too much about whether or not he was hit. In fact, he wore an eager expression as he looked at Long Xiangyue, asking, "Are you a descendant of a true dragon?" Long Xiangyue faltered momentarily. Why was he suddenly asking this during battle? She humphed before replying, "What's it have to do with you?" "It's got everything to do with me," Ling Han said seriously. "If you're the descendant of a true dragon, can you gift me a dragon horn when you reach the Genesis tier?" He still remembered his deal with the Heavenly Emperor of Thunder and Fire. Using the horn of a true dragon and the feather of a true phoenix, he would be able to exchange for a secret technique from the Heavenly Emperor. Thinking about it now, the Heavenly Emperor of Thunder and Fire was definitely an elite from the celestial realm. However, how had he managed to descend into the lower realm? Hu Niu, the Heavenly Emperor of Thunder and Fire, and also the Black Tower. All of these people and items that had once belonged to the celestial realm had somehow appeared in the same small world all at once. Regardless of how one thought about this, it was far too strange to be a coincidence. Thus, Ling Han was extremely proactive in trying to gather the 4 items from the divine beasts and exchanging them for the celestial technique, immovable deity metal body. In your dreams. Long Xiangyue shouted, her expression changing drastically. It was as if she had just suffered great humiliation. She slashed with her sword again, her attacks becoming even wilder and more ferocious than before. Moreover, while she had been attacking the floating rock beneath Ling Han's feet just then, she was now focusing her attacks on his body. Although the effects of shattering the floating rock or defeating Ling Han would be the same, seeing Long Xiangyue grit her teeth as her face flushed a fiery red told Ling Han that things weren't as simple as he thought. Strange. I'm only asking for a single dragon horn. In any case, you can regrow your dragon horn after I take one. Is there any need to become so worked up? It's not like I'm asking for your chastity or something. Little Han, to the dragon tribe, their horns are a token of love. By asking her for a dragon horn, are you trying to get in bed with her? The large black dog charged over at this moment, stopping around 18 meters away from Ling Han. Ha! Is that so? No wonder Long Xiangyue became so worked up and enraged. In fact, why has Helian Sun Shui never gifted me a dragon horn before? Is it because she was raised in the small world, where there's no such custom? Despicable dog! Long Xiangyue spat through gritted teeth. She suddenly turned to slash her sword at the large black dog. His explanation had been vulgar and uncouth, and it had simply added fuel to the fire. However, there were peculiar restrictions in this valley, so the sword light from her sword came to a sudden halt after shooting forward for a distance of 6 meters. It then mysteriously disappeared. The large black dog stood up like a human, a degenerate expression on his face as he said, "It's not Grandpa Dog that wants to bed you, it's that brat over there. Why are you taking your anger out on me? In any case, I happen to be missing some human pets, so I'm not against accepting you as my steed, even though you're the descendant of a true dragon." Ah! Long Xiangyue was wild with fury. Although she knew it was useless, she still launched a flurry of angry attacks toward the large black dog. The large black dog clasped his front claws behind his back, saying, "Your attacks are like the mere glow of fireflies before the brilliant moon, they're insignificant before me." Right now, it was as if he were obliterating Long Xiangyue's attacks before they could even near him. He was flexing wantonly and shamelessly. In fact, even Ling Han could barely bring himself to watch on. This large black dog was far too experienced in pissing people off. Die! However, in the next instant, Long Xiangyue had already swiveled back around to attack him. There was a frosty expression on her beautiful face, and it was clear that she was using him to vent her feelings of humiliation and rage. Fuck! That despicable dog! Ling Han instantly unleashed heaven's might. So what if Long Xiangyue was unleashing the rage of a true dragon? Her powerful aura was instantly reflected away before it could even reach him. At the same time, the devastating effects of heaven's might forcefully suppressed her power by 2 entire stars. Long Xiangyue immediately yelped in astonishment. She hadn't expected for her power to suddenly drop by 2 stars. She was completely unprepared for this, and thus even a king tier like her was momentarily flustered. Ling Han seized this opportunity and immediately slashed forward with his sword, instantly pushing Long Xiangyue off her floating rock. With her power weakened 100-fold, in addition to her emotions of fury and her flustered state, Long Xiangyue naturally couldn't unleash much of her power at this moment. She was defeated by Ling Han in a single strike. The floating rock beneath Ling Han's feet absorbed Long Xiangyue's floating rock, allowing him to instantly ascend another 6 meters. If he absorbed one more floating rock, he would be able to ascend the gigantic golden boulder. Meanwhile, looking at the hourglass, there were still 6 hours remaining. That's more than enough time. Right at this moment, Zi Chenfeng, second in the world, and Hong Ma almost all charged up at the same time. They had defeated the Rain Emperor, Chang Xiaofan, and a host of other Supreme King tiers to reach this level. Right now, it was time for the final battle. It was evident that someone would definitely ascend the gigantic golden boulder this time. However, which of them would it be? Each of the 4 Supreme King tiers had a chance. However, they didn't engage in battle straight away. This was because they were all wary of becoming the target of the 3 other King tiers. If that occurred, it was very likely that the targeted King tier would be defeated, regardless of how powerful they were. Below them, the Rain Emperor, Chang Xiaofan, Long Xiangyue, and the other king tiers that had been defeated were all charging back up at an astonishing pace. Once they reached this height again, they would add even more uncertainty to the battle. Ling Han and the three other king tiers all gazed at each other. Then, they all suddenly launched into action. None of them formed an alliance with another. Instead, they were engaged in an all-out melee. As long as one of them was defeated, someone else would be able to snatch their floating rock and ascend to the peak. This was the final battle. There was no time to waste, and they all charged toward their opponents. The four king tiers unleashed their most powerful attacks at each other. They didn't care whom they defeated first, as long as someone was defeated. Chapter 1457 Candied Hawthorn. Ling Han chuckled as he unleashed heaven's might. Wang! The expressions of the three other king tiers suddenly changed drastically. They were completely astounded. Their power had suddenly dropped by 2 entire stars. They each had their own way of dealing with this, yet they had been completely unprepared for their power to drop so sharply. Thus, they were completely unable to react in a timely manner. More detestable was the fact that Ling Han had only unleashed this technique after they had launched their own attacks. If he had unleashed Heaven's Might earlier, their attacks would have all been weakened by 100 or so times. Now, however, their attacks were all at full power as they hurtled toward their opponents. Meanwhile, their defenses had all been weakened by a whopping 100-fold. This was equivalent to 4 king tiers ganging up to attack people together. Yet apart from Ling Han, the other people had all been weakened 100-fold. That being the case, how could they withstand these attacks? Pang pang pang. Unsurprisingly, the 3 king tiers were all knocked off their floating rocks. Even so, the attacks were still unable to cause them any severe wounds. If this were under normal circumstances, these attacks would have barely affected them at all. However, right now was different. Once they were knocked off their floating rock, they could only fall to the bottom of the abyss. Ling Han instantly obtained 3 floating rocks. He was about to ascend the peak. The floating rock beneath his feet grew larger and larger as it absorbed the other floating rocks. At the same time, it started to rise upward, quickly nearing the height of the gigantic golden boulder above the valley. The people below him all watched on, disbelief on their faces. Who would have thought that the final victor would be Ling Han? He wasn't a rank 3 king tier. Ling Han! Gu Daoyi roared in fury. He was being obstructed by Empress Luan Xing, and thus he didn't even have the chance to fight for victory. This caused him to burn with indescribable rage. Ling Han, I'll kill you if you dare to take another step. Ling Han sneered and said, Kill me? You think I'm afraid of you? He raised his foot and stepped toward the gigantic golden boulder without a shred of hesitation. Golden light radiated from the gigantic golden boulder. This golden light then enveloped Ling Han, making him appear like a god of war, a god who was high in the heavens and transcendent above all other beings. This was an incredible sight. This is Grandpa Dog's great opportunity, the large black dog suddenly shouted. At some point in time, he had already risen to a height just 6 meters below Ling Han. However, there were already no more floating rocks for him to absorb. This didn't stop him though, and he leaped up with all his might, biting at Ling Han's foot. His speed was incredible, yet this valley had its own set of regulations. Just as he was about to reach Ling Han's foot, an intangible power suddenly appeared, acting as a net and instantly preventing him from reaching any higher. I'll bite! I'll bite! The large black dog shouted as he continued to gnash his jaws. A strange sight suddenly appeared, with the intangible net surprisingly bitten open by the large black dog. His head instantly poked through the hole. Snap! His jaws forcefully snapped down on Ling Han's toes. Fuck! Ling Han shouted through gritted teeth. His physique was indeed freakish, yet the large black dog's teeth were much like celestial tools, causing pain to shoot through his foot. Let go, you *T2I dog. Let go. Ling Han frantically shook his foot. No way. I won't let go even if I die. This is Grandpa Dog's great opportunity. Although he was biting onto Ling Han's toes, the large black dog was surprisingly still able to speak. One couldn't help but feel admiration for his abilities. Below them, Long Xiangyue was already closing in again. Ling Han sighed, and he had no option but to raise his foot. He was going to drag the large black dog up along with him. However, there were restrictions in this valley, after all, and the hole in the net was only large enough to fit the large black dog's head. It would be extremely difficult to pull his entire body through. It was as if Ling Han were lifting an immense weight as he slowly dragged the large black dog up, inch by inch. "Little Han, have you not had lunch? Hurry up! Hurry up! The violent woman is almost upon us." The large black dog urged Ling Han to act quicker. "Sh*TTY dog, hurry up and let go of me," Ling Han shouted in reply. "I won't let go even if I die," the large black dog shouted as he shook his head. At this moment, Long Xiangyue had already caught up to them. With her incredible power, she had essentially crushed all of her opponents as she easily soared up to this height. Only after reaching the last 30 meters did her speed finally slow down. There was nothing she could do about this. After all, there were far too few king tiers at this height. Even so, she still drew closer and closer to Ling Han and the large black dog. When she was just 6 meters below the large black dog, she suddenly slashed toward him with her sword. "Motherfucking B*TCH. The large black dog yelped in astonishment. However, his defenses were surprisingly no weaker than those of Ling Han. Upon striking him, Long Xiangyue's sword merely caused a series of sparks to fly into the air. However, the large black dog was completely unscathed. "The pain is killing me," the large black dog wailed. It was as if he were in a truly sorry state. The people beneath him all grimaced upon seeing this. "What the hell are you wailing about? Not a single strand of your hair has been injured. I've seen shameless people before, but I've never seen a being as shameless as you." Long Xiangyue was also stunned. Although she hadn't unleashed her full power just then, her attack should have still been powerful enough to at least slice off some of his hair. This despicable dog was far from ordinary. Ling Han was also astonished upon seeing this. However, he quickly recalled that the large black dog was from the celestial realm. He had been born from a celestial egg, and he had more so fallen into a slumber and cultivated for heaven knew how many years. Thus, it was only natural that he possessed some extraordinary abilities. Long Xiangyue slashed at him several more times, each slash eliciting agonized wails from the large black dog. However, not a single one of her attacks was able to cause him any tangible damage. The despicable dog was simply putting on a show. "Brat, hurry up and lift me up," the large black dog shouted. "Otherwise, my bum is about to be sliced into 2 pieces." "Nonsense. Whose bum isn't already 2 pieces?" Ling Han said with a chuckle. "Oh, Grandpa Dog was wounded, so I'm already becoming incomprehensible. Anyhow, hurry up and pull me up. Have you not eaten anything?" The large black dog started to urge Ling Han to hurry up again. Right now, Ling Han wanted to stomp on this *TTY dog's face. However, the large black dog wouldn't let go of his foot no matter what. Thus, Ling Han had no option but to pull him up with all his might. Only then would he be able to kick the large black dog and send him flying. With Ling Han exerting all of his strength, the large black dog was slowly dragged up, inch by inch. However, just as his midriff crossed the hole, Long Xiangyue suddenly leaped upward, grabbing onto his tail. It was clear that she wanted to be pulled up along with him. Shwa! The floating rock beneath her feet instantly fell down. At this moment, she was fully hanging off from the large black dog's tail. "Holy fuck! Is this really okay?" The people beneath them grimaced once again. They felt that the competition this year was truly lively and full of spectacular scenes. It was as if the 3 people had become a skewer of candied hawthorn. Could their appearance be any more hilarious than it was right now? "Stinky woman, hurry up and let go of me. Grandpa Dog's tail is about to be pulled apart by you," the large black dog barked. Long Xiangyue naturally ignored him, continuing to grip onto his tail. "There's a *T on my tail. That's not something that you want to touch," the large black dog shouted. Long Xiangyue remained silent. At this moment, Zi Chenfeng, second in the world, and Hong Ma had all risen up to just a few meters beneath them as well. Without speaking a word, they also leaped up and grabbed at the large black dog's tail. Since this was the situation right now, They were also hellbent on ascending to the gigantic golden boulder no matter what. Fuck! The people beneath them were already at a loss for words. There were several young king tears hanging off the tail of the large black dog. This was a strange yet comical sight, no matter how one looked at it. Were these people genuinely supreme king tears? More and more people charged up. Apart from Empress Luanxing and Gu Daoyu were still locked in an intense battle. The remaining supreme king tears all wanted a piece of the reward. Some of them were unable to withstand the violent winds that gusted through the final 30 meters, yet there were some who were still successful in charging up and grabbing onto the large black dog's tail. However, the large black dog's tail was only 2 feet long, so how could it possibly house the hands of so many people? It wasn't long before his tail was covered in hands. That being the case, those who arrived later all turned their attention to his 2 hind legs. And thereupon, his 2 hind legs were gradually transformed into skewers of candied hawthorn as well. In fact, there were also some smart people who tried to directly ascend the gigantic golden boulder on their floating rocks. However, following Ling Han's arrival at the peak, the last few meters of space had already been sealed. Apart from the hole that the large black dog had created, there was already no other path to reach the gigantic golden boulder. In other words, grabbing onto the large black dog was the only way up. The large black dog's face had already become beet red. This was primarily due to pain. Swathes of fur had already been ripped off his tail. In fact, his tail was already close to becoming bald. Secondly, this was due to Ling Han's jokes. He had used origin power to shut off his ears, yet Ling Han was using his divine sense to directly transmit his voice into his mind. As such, he had no option but to listen to his jokes. Moreover, the large black dog was very easily amused, so he couldn't help but laugh at Ling Han's jokes. This pained him greatly. He continued to bite onto Ling Han's foot, yet the corners of his mouth were involuntarily curling upward. This was the sight of him laughing. At the same time, however, tears were also streaming down his face. This was the sight of his pain. Put together, this was truly a very strange scene. What had once been a battle between king tears had now become a complete farce. In fact, even the great elite of the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He was unsure what expression he should wear at this moment. This was completely unprecedented. This time, someone had finally managed to reach the peak. They were destined to open the door to a new golden age of cultivation. However, the scene before them. Ha! Shwa! At this moment, another king tear dashed up. However, he was instantly sent flying by the powerful winds. Even so, his floating rock gave rise to a significant event. His floating rock allowed another king tear to rise upward, though this king tear was immediately defeated by another king tear, who had been bitterly awaiting an opponent for a long time. When the latter king tear rose up, he was also defeated by yet another king tear who had been bitterly awaiting an opponent. In other words, the ascent of the first king tier had triggered a series of battles that allowed all of the king tiers above him to rise by another level. However, the cost of this was all of the lower-level king tiers being defeated. Finally, another king tier managed to ascend to a height just 6 meters below Ling Han and the others. He leaped up with all his might, reaching toward the large black dog as he did so. "Don't come up!" the large black dog wailed in agony. There was already nowhere left to grab on his tail and legs. So what could this leaping king tear do? The king tear's eyes darted about, eventually settling on a small little thing. Although it was small, it was still large enough for him to grab onto. He showed no hesitation as he reached over and forcefully grabbed onto it. Ow wow! The large black dog's expression changed drastically. In fact, his expression was so complicated that even words would fail to completely describe it. Everyone was stunned. This was because in a moment of sheer panic, the king tear had actually grabbed onto the little buddy between the large black dog's legs. There was a mountain hanging off the large black dog's manhood. What kind of concept was this? Even with the astonishing physique of the large black dog, he still hadn't tempered that area to a very powerful level. "Fuck you and your ancestors!" the large black dog shouted as he sobbed. He finally couldn't help but let go of Ling Han's foot. Boom! The king tears hanging onto the large black dog instantly plummeted down along with him. This was a spectacular sight to behold. Zi Chen Feng. Long Xiang Yue. Second in the world. All the other king tears. Holy fuck. Ha 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 ha. The spectators beneath all exploded with laughter. They finally couldn't suppress their laughter any longer. Meanwhile, Ling Han's foot was finally able to step onto the gigantic golden boulder. At this moment, he had finally completed his ascent. Wang! A streak of golden light enveloped him, and his body instantly vanished from sight. Meanwhile, sweet dew started to rain down from heaven and earth, nurturing all of the cultivators that were currently in the second stage. However, those king tears that had fallen down with the large black dog were all stripped of this opportunity. The competition had come to an end, and even the battling Empress Luan Xing and Gu Daoyi were forced to stop their attacks. They were unable to overcome the regulations of this valley, and right now was more so a time to absorb the blessings of heaven and earth. Thus, they knew that they shouldn't cause any more trouble. Those in the second stage all sat down and crossed their legs, channeling their cultivation techniques to absorb as much of the sweet dew as they could. As for those below the second stage, they could only leave in bitterness and exasperation. The large black dog was wild with fury, and he ferociously ran about and tried to bite everyone in his way. If it weren't for these people grabbing onto him, he would have definitely been dragged onto the gigantic golden boulder by Ling Han. Moreover, one of the king tears had actually grabbed onto his pee-pee. Grandpa Dog is going to bite you people to death. He became a wild dog, chasing after and biting everyone that he could see. In the beginning, the king tears all let him have his way. After all, it was they who were in the wrong. However, the large black dog didn't show any restraint or signs of stopping, and thus his actions finally enraged the king tears as well. Motherfucker! They hadn't received any benefits, either. They were also incredibly pissed off. The king tears gradually started to counterattack. When the number of counterattacking king tears exceeded 10, the large black dog was finally unable to withstand their attacks. He had no choice but to turn around and flee. He became a despised pest once again, a dog who was chased and beaten wherever he went. Woof, woof, woof. Grandpa Dog will definitely return again. After shouting this, the large black dog transformed into a streak of black that shot away from the sunken abyss valley. The king tears finally stopped pursuing him. This large black dog was incredibly quick and agile, and they were completely incapable of catching up to him. With the large black dog gone, they all looked up at the sky. Right now, the gigantic golden boulder was radiating with a tremendous and dazzling divine light. Ling Han. What great opportunity has he received? Chapter 1459 Great Opportunity. What great opportunity am I going to receive? Ling Han was also eager to know. The golden boulder continued to glow, and Ling Han discovered that the boulder beneath his feet was actually melting. It was as if it were becoming water. Meanwhile, it was as if he were about to sink into this water. During this process, Ling Han had even considered escaping into the Black Tower. After all, this was an unpredictable event. Although the sunken Abyss Valley was renowned as a place to obtain great opportunities, Ling Han was still afraid of the what if. Ling Han had entered many ancient sites before, and which time hadn't he come across some rare opportunity? However, these opportunities had all come with a serving of disaster. Take, for example, the Devil's Sky Mystery Realm, where the Azura Demon Emperor had escaped from. There was also the Heavenly Sea Mystery Realm, where he had come across Demon Master Zhen Yi. Then there was the Yellow Spring Mystery Realm, where he had almost been screwed over by the Notionless Saint. Indeed, Ling Han had a habit of coming across rare opportunities that were accompanied by dangers that could screw him over. Thus, he didn't dare to let his guard down at this moment. No one had ever ascended this peak before, so it was in his best interests to remain alert and wary. Fortunately, he was simply sinking into the melting rock. No other danger swooped down at him. Eventually, his entire body was enveloped by the rock. It was also at this moment that he appeared in a strange place. This place was dotted with stars, though these stars were definitely not real. They seemed to be close enough to touch, yet they also seemed to be far away on the horizon at the same time. Meanwhile, he was treading through the void, though it felt as if he were walking on solid ground. He didn't feel any emptiness and weightlessness. Surprisingly, there was actually an independent space inside the gigantic golden boulder. Ling Han continued to advance, yet his surroundings didn't change no matter how far he walked. He was still surrounded by the void and a plethora of stars. "Where's my great opportunity?" "Oi!" Ling Han shouted. "Is there anyone here?" After shouting this, even he wanted to laugh at his own stupidity. "Yes." At this moment, however, someone actually responded to his question. Ling Han's heart jolted, and he solemnly asked, "Who's there?" "Someone who's already been dead for a long, long time," the voice replied. "Heh." Ling Han wasn't easily convinced by this reply. In this day and age, there were far too many dead people crawling out and running all over the place. "How should I refer to you, senior?" he asked. "Me?" The voice faltered for a moment before continuing. "I'm called Hu Yu. Now that I think about it, I'm a person who died tens of billions of years ago." "Then for what reason has Senior summoned me into this place?" Ling Han asked. "To bestow upon you a great opportunity," Hu Yu replied. Ling Han was unflustered and he calmly asked, "Dare I ask, what is this great opportunity that you speak of?" Hu Yu replied with a question, asking, "Brat, do you know that there's another realm transcendent above the immortal realm?" Ling Han was slightly astonished. Could it be that this dead elite had also come from the celestial realm? This was extremely likely. After all, even the Star Sand Saint was unable to do anything about this place. Just this alone was enough to prove that the creator of this place was at least at the level of Saint King. Once one advanced past the level of Saint King, they would reach the level of the Severing Mundane tier. However, this was a tier that could only exist in the celestial realm. "Celestial realm?" Ling Han replied with a chuckle. Truth be told, he was actually one of the ancestors of the ancient divine tribes, a first-generation elite from the celestial realm. However, these powerful tribes and bloodlines had actually been banished from the celestial realm. Ling Han remained silent. In fact, he only knew very little about the ancient divine tribes. Similarly, he didn't know much about the celestial realm, either. As such, his best choice was naturally to remain silent. The more he spoke, the more likely it was that he would make a mistake. Hu Yu didn't become suspicious. He said, "Since you're aware of the existence of the celestial realm, I don't need to waste any more time explaining. I can gift you a rare treasure from the celestial realm as well as a secret technique from the celestial realm. However, in exchange, you need to help me kill someone." "Whom do you want me to kill?" Ling Han asked. "Why don't you explain in more detail?" "I don't have a habit of wantonly killing innocent people. Unless they deserve to die, I'd rather forfeit whatever inheritance it is that you wish to bestow upon me." In any case, the Black Tower was already the most powerful rare treasure of the celestial realm, one of the most powerful, at the very least. Thus, Ling Han wasn't overly greedy when it came to the so-called rare treasures of the celestial realm. He wouldn't abandon his principles and stoop below his own bottom line to obtain these rare treasures. "Ha ha ha ha." Hu Yu laughed haughtily and said, "Very well, very well. I very much like people of principle. Since this is the case, let me tell you a story." He paused for a moment before starting to tell his story. "I'm the last member of the Hu clan. 10 billion years ago, the specific time has already become fuzzy. Great unrest swept throughout the entire celestial realm. Countless forces, including some of the most powerful forces, were all subject to existential catastrophes. All of them were banished from the celestial realm. Although my Hu clan couldn't be regarded as a first-rate force of the celestial realm, it was still powerful enough to be regarded as a mighty regional force. There were Severing Mundane tier Grand Elders in my clan. Moreover, my clan had also obtained a rare treasure before. However, after countless years of investigation, we were still unable to determine the usage of this rare treasure. During the period of great unrest, the Hu clan wisely chose to protect itself, not participating in the battles. However, one of the clans, Hu Yu's voice suddenly became cold, and it was as if he were gritting his teeth in anger. They maliciously targeted and smeared my Hu Yu's name, claiming that we were a supporter of the great unrest. As a result, a supreme elite descended to massacre the entire Hu clan. What that clan wanted was the rare treasure that my clan had obtained. They had been an intimate friend of our clan before, yet when our defenses were down, they suddenly turned around to stab us in the back. I was only able to escape death because I had been out adventuring and training at the time. After learning of this news, I immediately returned to the ancestral grounds to retrieve that rare treasure. Although that clan searched many times, they were completely unable to find the whereabouts of the rare treasure. However, they continued to keep an eye out, eventually discovering my existence. They then turned their attention onto me, starting to hunt me down relentlessly. Taking the rare treasure with me, I eventually fled from the celestial realm. However, I was severely wounded during this process, and I eventually succumbed to my wounds. However, a wisp of my damaged soul actually fused together with the rare treasure. It was only then that I finally discovered the true use of the rare treasure. It was a shame that it was already too late. With the support of this rare treasure, my wisp of damaged soul was able to survive for generation after generation. I lived on for no other reason but to search for a supreme prodigy, someone who could one day enter the celestial realm and exact revenge for my Hu clan. Hu Yu's voice had become shrill, and it was clear that he was filled with boundless fury. After listening to his story, it was clear that he had indeed suffered immensely. Ling Han mulled over this for a moment before saying, "Then this sunken abyss valley should actually be called the Deep Injustice Valley." "That's indeed the case," Hu Yu replied. "I could only channel a limited amount of power of the rare treasure and transform the environment of heaven and earth in this area. Doing so allowed me to attract generation after generation of prodigies to this place. Now, after so many years, a suitable candidate has finally appeared before me. I don't ask for you to kill all of the enemies of the Hu clan, just the leader of their betrayal. Make a vow to the Tao of heaven and earth that you'll definitely complete this task. After taking this vow, I'll give you the rare treasure and also teach you the ultimate technique of the Hu clan. If everything is as Senior has said, I'll definitely exact revenge for the Hu clan when I enter the celestial realm and become powerful enough." Ling Han raised his hand and completed a Tao oath. The higher one's cultivation level, the more serious taking a Tao oath would become. This was because powerful elites could already rouse the regulations of heaven and earth. In other words, it was as if they were being watched over by an eye in the heavens. "Very well," Hu Yu said with a hearty laugh. It was as if he could already see his mortal enemies being obliterated into ashes. Chapter 1469 Heaven's Flame. The mortal enemy of the Hu clan is Dark Moon City's Ding clan. Hu Yu gritted his teeth as he said this, his voice filled with fury and resentment. "What? The Ding clan?" Ling Han's heart shuddered. Could this be Ding Yaolong's and Ding Zizhen's Ding clan? He didn't have time to ask, as Hu Yu had already channeled the rare treasure and started to funnel it toward him. This is the Nine Heavens Flame, and it's sealed inside this golden rock. External forces are unable to shatter this rock. This is a rare treasure that the Hu clan obtained from an ancient historical site. There are 100 types of origin flames in the immortal realm, yet at their core, these flames are all descended from 9 types of flames from the celestial realm. These 9 flames are called the 9 great ancestral flames, and these are the ancestors of all the flames in the world. The 9 Heavens Flame is one of these ancestral flames. Of course, this flame here is only a young flame of the 9 Heavens Flame. It's only just been born, and thus it doesn't possess a terrifying might. Moreover, it's been sealed into this sunstone by an ancient great elite. I'll refine it into your body now. When you manage to fully refine this young flame and transform it into your source flame, this wisp of 9 Heavens Flame will eventually grow into an ancestral flame. At that time, you'll gain unimaginable power. It's a shame that my damaged soul was only able to enter this sunstone after my death. It was only then that I finally managed to learn of its power. Stay focused and cooperate with me. This 9 Heavens Flame is an ancestral flame, and it still possesses a profound power even though it's only a young flame, and even though it's sealed inside a sunstone. If you're not careful, you'll be incinerated into ashes. Fuck. Hu Yu was still speaking, yet he was suddenly shocked to such an extent that he couldn't help but curse. He couldn't help himself. After all, the sight before him was far too astounding. The Nine Heavens flame was being casually absorbed and refined by Ling Han, gradually fusing into his life force into the portion that represented fire. This was far too casual. This was far too smooth. In Hu Yu's estimation, it should have taken Ling Han at least 1,000,000 years to completely refine the Nine Heavens flame. This was an ancestral flame, after all, something that even the mighty figures of the celestial realm would fight over. Why was it so gentle and obedient right now? Little did he know that Ling Han had already tempered his body inside the immortal flames provided by the Black Tower numerous times. In fact, he had already tempered his body so much that he had mastered the secret technique, rising from the ashes. Right now, Hu Yu was telling him to refine an immortal flame, an ancestral flame. Yet, in reality, the might of this flame was far inferior to the might of the flames of immortal phoenixes. That being the case, what difficulty would Ling Han face when refining it? Countless divine patterns materialized across Ling Han's body, their complicated patterns far beyond any other technique that he had mastered. In fact, these weren't divine patterns, but celestial patterns. Boom! Scorching flames burst from Ling Han's body, transforming into numerous immortal phoenixes. Under the stimulation of the ancestral flame, his grasp of the secret technique, rising from the ashes, was currently advancing at a rapid pace. In the past, he could only rise from the ashes once. Afterward, he would need to spend a long time recovering the power of his life force before he could use the secret technique again. However, following his rapid advance, he now saw the potential to activate rising from the ashes twice in a row, perhaps even thrice. Of course, right now was still too early for him to achieve this. At this moment, he was working toward being able to use rising from the ashes twice in a row. In any case, he had only just discovered this potential. Have I come across a freak? Hu Yu murmured to himself. Ling Han's talent was so great that he could be regarded as a top-notch prodigy, even in the celestial realm. Generally speaking, only the true sons and true daughters of top-notch sex could exhibit such tremendous talent. In fact, these prodigies might not even give him a shred of attention, even if he retrieved the entire wealth of the Hu clan. Of course, this was under the condition that he didn't reveal the Nine Heavens flame. Yet, in this backward and primitive world, there was actually a prodigy who was just as talented as the true sons and true daughters of the celestial realm. This astonished him greatly. At the same time, it also delighted him immensely. The Hu clan can finally exact its revenge. In reality, he had actually been more eager to see Gu Daoyi achieve victory. After all, this was a divine fetus who was no weaker than any prodigy in the celestial realm. However, it was a shame that Gu Daoyi hadn't managed to make it to the peak. Now, however, he was filled with delight. Ling Han was no weaker than Gu Daoyi. I'll teach you the ultimate technique of the Hu clan as you refine the Nine Heavens flame, Hu Yu said joyfully. I'll imprint it into your mind so that you can slowly comprehend it in the future. Regarding our revenge, this isn't a pressing matter. It's better that you act after coming up with a suitable plan. Although the Ding clan isn't a large clan in the celestial realm, with severing mundane tier grand elders being their most powerful elites, there still exists an insurmountable gulf between celestials and immortals. Even if you're a supreme prodigy, it'll still be incredibly difficult to defeat those grand elders. Moreover, the Ding clan has elites at the fourth severance of the severing mundane tier. Their power is incredibly terrifying. As if he were afraid that Ling Han didn't understand, he continued to explain this concept, saying, Celestials are different from mortals or immortals. In order to reach the celestial level, one must sever all of their mundane and worldly desires. The first severs heaven, the second earth, the third love, and the fourth karma. After severing these mundane matters, one will naturally become a being of themselves. In other words, one will become their own heaven and earth. After succeeding in the first one will advance to the low extreme of the severing mundane tier. Such elites are also referred to as first severance grand elders. The Ding clan has fourth severance grand elders, and this corresponds to a cultivation at the consummate level of the severing mundane tier. These are old freaks who have cultivated for heaven knows how many years. Before you have the absolute confidence to defeat them, you definitely can't reveal your identity. Otherwise, you'll place yourself into perilous danger. Ling Han couldn't speak at this moment, and his mind was more so swimming with all kinds of mystical symbols. These were the symbols of the Hu clan's ultimate technique. In fact, he couldn't even use his divine sense to communicate. All he could do was remain silent and listen. Great Evolution Technique. Darkness of the Paramount Night. Sword of Mundane Washing Rain. Dark Grief Origin Dragon Destruction. Song of the Ages. Countless secret techniques whirled inside Ling Han's mind. However, not all of them were celestial-level secret techniques. The Hu clan was only at the same level as the Ding clan, with both of them being severing mundane tier forces. Thus, only a limited number of their techniques were celestial-level secret techniques. The remaining techniques were all Genesis tier secret techniques. However, one of the celestial techniques astonished Ling Han greatly. In fact, this secret technique further strengthened his belief that this was indeed the Ding clan of Ding Zizhen and Ding Yaolong. Song of the Ages. Not Tide of the Ages, but Song of the Ages. However, there was definitely an intimate relationship between these two celestial techniques. Moreover, one of the mystical symbols caused Ling Han to feel a strong sense of familiarity. If he comprehended this symbol under the reincarnation tree, he would be able to completely understand it after comprehending it for 100 years of real time. This celestial technique is more powerful. The Tide of the Ages only possessed a single ability to age the attacks of the opponent. However, Song of the Ages could do even more than that. It could reverse the passage of time, allowing one to look into the past. In fact, this ability could even allow one to predict the future. This was the complete version of the celestial technique. The Ding clan had most likely raided the Hu clan and obtained a copy of this celestial technique. Afterward, with the passing of time, this celestial technique had eventually become the bloodline inheritance of the Ding clan, the Tide of the Ages. This also revealed that Ding Zizhen had most likely died far after the destruction of the Hu clan. Powerful celestial techniques could be fused into one's bloodline and passed down onto future generations. However, following the destruction of the Hu clan, the Song of the Ages had eventually become an ultimate technique of the Ding clan. This was truly a twist of fate that would make one sigh with pity. The Nine Heavens flame took root inside Ling Han's body, becoming his source flame. During this process, his cultivation naturally advanced as well. This was because the ancestral flame was far too powerful and high level. Even though it was only fusing with Ling Han, it still brought him boundless and immeasurable benefits. Meanwhile, in the outside world, the king tiers in the second stage were still bathed in the sweet dew and the blessings of heaven and earth. In fact, this blessing of heaven and earth was bestowed by the Sunstone. This was a rare treasure of the celestial realm, so even an iota of its power was enough to bring great benefits to the cultivators of the immortal realm and allow them to undergo astonishing transformations. It's already been half a month, so why has it still not concluded yet? In the past, it would have concluded after a maximum of 10 days. Could it be because someone ascended that gigantic golden boulder? These people are so fortunate. Some people are also incredibly unfortunate. The incredibly unfortunate people naturally included Zi Chenfeng, Long Xiangyue, second in the world, and the other rank 3 king tiers. In stark contrast to them, Gu Daoui was able to receive the blessings of heaven and earth because he had been locked in an intense battle with Empress Luan Xing at the time. His divine fetus was profoundly mysterious, and it was as if he were about to hover away with the wind and directly ascend into the celestial realm. 1 month, 2 months, 6 months. The blessings of heaven and earth continued to shower the prodigies in the second stage of the valley. In fact, this mysterious event even astonished a saint, who personally traveled over to check on the situation. Only after confirming that there was no harm being done to the prodigies did he leave the sunken abyss valley. 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. Time slowly crept by. Most people had already left, yet their shock still had yet to dissipate. The blessings of heaven and earth were far too astonishing this time. Those who had reached the second stage of the competition were destined to soar far above all other prodigies. This was already the case with the prodigies in the second stage. So what about Ling Han? Chapter 1461 Twofold Heavenly Tribulation. 10 years slowly crept by. Humans were forgetful beings, and thus there was already very little attention on what was going on in the sunken abyss valley. Even though such astounding events had occurred there 10 years ago, even astonishing a saint, Many people had already become accustomed to its current state. The cultivators who had successfully reached the second stage were still bathing in the blessing of heaven and earth that was exuded by the sunstone, tempering their bodies. The most evident sign of this was their physique, where a sheen of light was continuously pulsating. It was possible that they could master the legendary sun physique, a physique that could unleash a dazzling glow when they were battling against their opponents. Not only could this glow affect their opponent's vision, but it could even trick their divine sense. This was an incredibly powerful physique. Moreover, physiques that were mastered later in life and not naturally possessed wouldn't affect one's original bloodline or physique. In other words, they could be viewed as a mystical power. Thus, this would bring huge benefits to all of the cultivators in the second stage. However, one person was different. Gu Dawi. This was because he had already mastered a mystical power, dazzle the heavens, in his first life. This mystical power had similar effects to the sun physique. Thus, even though he had now combined the two mystical powers, elevating the might of the former, the benefit that he had received from this was far inferior to that of the other cultivators. After all, they had learned a new mystical power, whereas he had simply seen some slight improvement in his own mystical power. This was still better than nothing though, just that his improvement was far too minute. Wang! At this moment, the light that was enveloping the valley suddenly vanished. Everyone opened their eyes at the same time. The blessings of heaven and earth had finally come to an end. I think I've mastered an incredible mystical power. Gasp! I actually advanced from the early stage of the medium extreme to the middle stage of the medium extreme. Me too. I advanced from the middle stage of the high extreme to the late stage of the high extreme. My physique has grown stronger, and it seems like I can absorb spiritual qi and sense the existence of heaven and earth with far more ease. The cultivators all shouted in delight and astonishment. After absorbing the blessings of heaven and earth for 10 years, all of them had experienced tremendous improvements. Gu Dawi was slightly baffled at first. However, killing intent quickly spread across his face as he looked at the gigantic golden boulder in the sky. He felt like his great opportunity had been stolen from him. His divine fetus had indeed advanced slightly, yet this improvement wasn't especially great. Moreover, receiving the sun physique was completely negligible for him. In addition, he had already reached the barrier of the peak stage of the heavenly body tier, so unless he advanced to the eternal river tier, he would barely see any improvements in his cultivation. If the benefits received by the others were given a score of 10 out of 10, then the benefits that he had received would only score a maximum of 1 out of 10. More detestable was the fact that Ling Han might have received benefits that scored 100 out of 10. He was seething with killing intent. Regardless of what benefits Ling Han had received, he would definitely steal them away from him. This great fortune could only belong to him. Boom! He soared into the sky. The sunken abyss valley had already returned to normal at this moment, so he could naturally use the ability of flight. In his eyes, a distance of 3,000 meters was nothing, and he covered this distance in the blink of an eye. He then ruthlessly lashed out, swiping his palm at the gigantic golden boulder. At that time, he had clearly seen Ling Han being absorbed into the gigantic golden boulder. Moreover, he believed that Ling Han was still inside. Now that he was attacking an unprepared Ling Han, he was convinced that he could severely injure or even kill him. After all, he wasn't at the low extreme of the heavenly body tier anymore. Rather, he had already regained his normal cultivation. He was at the peak stage of the pinnacle level, and he possessed the ability to kill even elites at the low extreme of the eternal river tier. You dare! Empress Luan Xing dashed over to block him. Stop! The Rain Emperor also lashed out. You dare to disrespect my master? Ding Ping and Zhou Yao also charged over. Although Su Ran, the Notionless Saint, and the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden didn't speak, they also launched attacks toward Gu Dawi. Do you think ants like you can stop me? Gu Dawi said with a sneer. He had already regained his power now, and he more so possessed a divine fetus and 10 lifetimes of mystical power. Who in the heavenly body tier could stop him? He simply made a pressing motion with his left hand to defend against their attacks. Meanwhile, his right hand continued to slap toward the gigantic golden boulder. He was exuding a mighty aura as he battled against 7 king tiers alone. Pang! There was a deafening rumble as Gu Dawi's palm struck the gigantic golden boulder. At the same time, the gigantic golden boulder also started to crumble, disintegrating into millions upon billions of broken pieces. In fact, these disintegrating shards of rock were so small that they were invisible to the naked eye. The attacks of Empress Luan Xing and the others arrived immediately afterward. However, Gu Daoi's left hand transformed into a gigantic black demonic palm that blocked all of their ferocious attacks. However, Gu Daoi frowned slightly as he raised his left hand. To his surprise, there were 3 fractures on his palm. One was caused by Empress Luan Xing, one by the Rain Emperor, and one by the Notionless Saint. He couldn't help but feel astonished. There were actually 3 people who could wound him. He had underestimated them. However, the other cultivators in the abyss were even more stunned. 7 King Tiers had attacked in unison, and among them, there were even the Supreme King Tiers, King Tier Assassin and Fists Demon, yet they had only managed to draw a few streaks of blood from Gu Daoi's palm. Gu Daoi was truly a powerful being. He truly lived up to his name as the greatest prodigy of all eternity. However, many people also turned their gaze toward where the gigantic golden boulder had once been. In that spot, there was a person standing tall and proud. It was Ling Han. Had Gu Daoi shattered the sunstone? The answer was evidently negative. Not to mention that he was only at the heavenly body tier, he wouldn't have been able to shatter it even if he had regained the peak power of his past lives. Otherwise, wouldn't the Hu clan have obtained the 9 heavens flame tens of billions of years ago? In fact, it was because its essence had already been completely absorbed that the sunstone had become so weak and brittle. Since it had lost its essence and become an ordinary stone, it was naturally extremely weak, and would shatter under a single strike. Ling Han's eyes were shut, and there was still a wealth of information whirling about in his mind. He still had yet to come to his senses. The 9 heavens flame had already taken root and become a part of his life force. Although it was still a young flame, it would grow along with his cultivation. In the future, its power would astound even celestial kings. Quang! There was the rumble of thunder as dark clouds rolled over and arcs of brilliant white lightning intertwined across the sky. That layer of dark clouds, those 1,000-meter-long arcs of lightning, all of these caused a feeling apprehension to rise in the cultivators' hearts. Is this an apocalypse? Why is it so terrifying? The cultivators all shook their heads. Although many of them had advanced in cultivation, none of them had managed to advance to the next minor level. This was a barrier that they had to comprehend and overcome by themselves. Thus, this wasn't heavenly tribulation for them. They were all extremely curious. Whose tribulation was this? It was far too devastating. Gu Daoi still wanted to attack, yet he had no option but to forcefully suppress his urge. He discovered that this was Ling Han's heavenly tribulation. However, this tribulation was far too terrifying, so much so that even he felt apprehensive about it. If he interfered, it was very likely that he would die. He was beside himself with shock. How could there exist such a formidable heavenly tribulation? However, Ling Han wasn't surprised in the least. This was because he had already advanced to the peak stage of the pinnacle level. As such, this was a twofold heavenly tribulation that he was facing. That being the case, its might was naturally far greater than normal. Why didn't his heavenly tribulations arrive one after the other? This was because the sunstone had severed the senses of heaven and earth. Ordinary stones naturally couldn't achieve this. However, this was a celestial stone, meaning that the level of its existence was far transcendent above that of the immortal realm. Thus, it was naturally possible for it to sever the senses of heaven. Quang! Heavenly tribulation rapidly gathered above Ling Han. Before long, a bolt of lightning that measured 300 meters in width violently struck down, directly striking at Ling Han's head. This was twofold heavenly tribulation, and the might of its whole was far greater than the sum of its parts. In fact, it was 10 times more powerful. Pa! The cultivators witnessed everything clearly. After a single strike, Ling Han's body had already become a broken mess of ripped flesh and shattered bones. He's died just like that. Although this heavenly tribulation is indeed powerful, isn't it far too pathetic to die after just a single strike? He didn't even put up a struggle. However, Gu Daoi's expression became even more solemn. He possessed a divine fetus, and thus he could sense Ling Han's condition even through the powerful tribulation. Ling Han hadn't died. His aura still remained. In fact, Ling Han had actively shattered his own body in order to be tempered by the heavenly tribulation. He was an absolute freak. This was because he was wearing iron underwear. It was clear that he had been mentally scarred after having his little pee-pee grabbed at that time. With the protection of an invincible iron underwear, it was quite likely that his little pee-pee would be safe from attacks now. He clasped his front paws behind his back as he walked forward like a human. However, with his shiny pair of iron underwear, was this not a hilarious and comical sight? Many of the cultivators in the abyss had been cultivating in seclusion these past 10 years, so this was their first time seeing the large black dog in such a state. They couldn't help but splutter with laughter. Was this some sort of joke? Who's laughing? Who's laughing? Show yourself to Grandpa Dog. The large black dog was ticked off, and he instantly raised his paw and pointed in the direction of the laughter. Ha 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 ha. However, his strong reaction elicited even more and louder laughter from the cultivators. In fact, some people were laughing so hard that they could barely stand up straight. Meanwhile, some of them already had tears streaming down their face. This large black dog was far too shameless and degenerate. Woof! Grandpa Dog is going to bite your bums into 3 pieces. The large black dog charged over in embarrassment and fury. The abyss instantly descended into chaos. Ling Han was facing heavenly tribulation, Empress Luan Xing was locked in an intense battle with Gu Daoyi, and now the large black dog transformed into a rabid dog, biting anyone that he could get his mouth on. The abyss was plunged into turmoil. Ling Han had actively shattered his flesh and godly bones in order to be tempered by heavenly tribulation. However, he had genuinely gone slightly overboard this time. The divine lightning unleashed by the tribulation became more and more powerful, yearning to kill him with each strike. Heaven and earth couldn't be belittled. Ling Han had advanced 2 minor levels before exiting the Sunstone to face the tribulation. This was an act of deception toward heaven and earth. Thus, he naturally had to face the punishment of heaven and earth. Heavenly tribulation became more and more powerful. It had already been descending for more than half a day. In fact, it still continued to descend even after an entire day had passed. Ling Han felt that this wasn't a good sign. In the beginning, he had only been struggling slightly. However, he had still been able to withstand it without any problems. Yet, this heavenly tribulation was becoming more and more powerful with each lightning strike that it unleashed. So be it if it had only lasted for only half a day. In fact, Ling Han could have endured it even if it had lasted for an entire day. After all, this was a twofold heavenly tribulation. However, a day had already passed. Yet this tribulation still had yet to show any sign of abating and dissipating. Instead, it was becoming even more powerful. What was the meaning of this? He circulated a drop of indestructible true fluid to reform his godly bones. He then started to resist heavenly tribulation with his full power. There was already no need to temper his body anymore. This was because his physique had already become more powerful than level 13 godly metal. This was the limit of what he could achieve at his current cultivation level. Moreover, his tribulation was also becoming increasingly terrifying, and thus he needed to defend against its attacks with his full might and power. Gasp! The surrounding cultivators were all stunned. Who had ever witnessed such a long heavenly tribulation before? Heavenly tribulation half a day long was already overwhelming enough to kill most cultivators. A tribulation 1 day long was simply unfathomable. Yet, Ling Han's tribulation had already lasted for longer than a day. If they hadn't witnessed this with their own eyes, who would have believed it? This is a situation of certain death. But if he can survive this tribulation, his future prospects will definitely be boundless. Several elderly seniors remarked on this astonishing scene. Ling Han had enraged the heavens and provoked them to unleash the most powerful punishments of divine lightning. However, if he could withstand this formidable punishment, he would undoubtedly be blessed with tremendous luck and fortune. Fortune couldn't be touched, nor could it be seen. However, it was something that no one was able to ignore. In fact, its importance was arguably above that of all other matters. After all, If one was blessed with great fortune, perhaps they might receive a divine pill that allowed them to become a celestial straight away. If that were the case, how many king tiers and supreme prodigies would they surpass? Ling Han started to struggle more and more. The might of his heavenly tribulation had already surpassed the early stage of the low extreme of the eternal river tier long ago. At the half-a-day mark, it had already reached the medium extreme. After reaching the one-day mark, it had already grown to the high extreme. Right now, it was even advancing toward the late stage of the high extreme. Theoretically speaking, this was a tribulation that could easily kill even elites at the peak stage of the pinnacle level of the heavenly body tier. So, how could Ling Han not feel the struggle? He gritted his teeth as he continued to withstand its attacks, unleashing all of his most powerful techniques. The technique that he unleashed the most was naturally the Tide of the Ages. This was a celestial technique that could age and deconstruct attacks. Although it wasn't especially effective against the tribulation, any bit of help was welcome. Meanwhile, Ling Han also continued to furiously channel the indestructible Heaven Scroll, using this celestial cultivation technique to protect his body. This celestial cultivation technique was arguably the most powerful cultivation technique of the celestial realm. The indestructible Heaven Scroll had never been impressive when it came to offensive ability. However, when it came to defensive ability, Ling Han had never come across any cultivation technique that was more powerful than this. Blood continued to explode from Ling Han's body. In fact, even his level 13 godly bones were creaking and groaning as if they were about to collapse at any moment. However, there was a halo of golden light enveloping his body, allowing him to rapidly recover from his severe wounds. Undying and indestructible. The spectating cultivators were all stunned into silence. They had always known that Ling Han possessed a powerful and freakish physique. However, they hadn't known just how powerful or freakish it was. At this moment, they were finally able to witness its overwhelming might with their very own eyes. I definitely can't become enemies with this person in the future. His physique is far too fucking powerful. Even such a terrifying heavenly tribulation isn't able to kill him. Yet another 12 hours passed, and the might of the tribulation had already advanced to the peak stage of the low extreme. This caused even Ling Han to feel incredibly apprehensive. With a single strike, a large cloud of his blood exploded into the surrounding sky. After a few more strikes, it was inevitable that his godly bones would also be shattered. At that time, he would be in perilous danger. Is this the end? Chapter 1463 Seeking Life in the Midst of Death. He's done for, the cultivators exclaimed as they shook their heads. However, they were genuinely impressed that he was able to withstand that devastating heavenly tribulation until now. What Ling Han was facing was the fury of heaven and earth. The power of humans was limited, yet the power of heaven and earth was unlimited. As such, how could he withstand the punishment of heaven and earth? Not a single person thought that Ling Han wasn't a prodigy. However, even so, there was little more that he could do. Before the might of heaven and earth, even Genesis tier saints had to bow their proud heads. If this weren't the case, saints should have been able to resist the fateful cycle of life, sickness and death. They should have been able to transcend the regulations of heaven and earth. However, not only did saints have a limited lifespan, but they even had to face their own form of tribulation, immortals' tribulation. If they failed to withstand this, their life force would be mercilessly severed. This was enough to prove that heaven and earth could kill whomever they wanted. Once the will of heaven and earth was set, no one could possibly seek to change it. In any case, who told Ling Han to obtain such a great opportunity, advancing 2 minor levels at once? Now that he was facing a twofold heavenly tribulation, he had no option but to die with bitterness and regret. Moreover, who would have imagined that Ling Han's great opportunity would wound up becoming his great disaster? However, some people were extremely glad to witness his misfortune. Since they were unable to become a powerful king tier themselves, they took great joy in witnessing the death of those powerful king tiers. In fact, they yearned for everyone more powerful than themselves to be killed. That way, they would finally be able to make a name for themselves. This doesn't seem right. This brat isn't destined to die so young. The large black dog stopped chasing and biting people, standing up on his hind legs and clasping his front paws behind his back. An enigmatic aura emanated from him, and it was as if he were pondering a profound question. However, the sight of his iron underwear completely ruined his solemn and profound airs. Anyhow, he immediately revealed his true colors anyway, shaking his head and saying, "Forget about it. Whether he lives or dies has *t to do with Grandpa Dog." Ling Han's situation was becoming direr and direr. His heavenly tribulation was becoming increasingly powerful, and even with the protection of the indestructible Heaven Scroll, the speed of his recovery was still far slower than the speed at which he was getting wounded. From his head to toe, it was almost impossible to find any piece of unshattered bone. However, he was still fighting, determination and tenacity in his eyes. He would never give up. He would fight until the last moment. He had already summoned his divine demon sword long ago, this sword radiating with a brilliant celestial light as it resisted the attacks of the tribulation. Even though it was only a level 11 god tool, it was radiating an aura that could sow apprehension in one's heart. It possessed a wisp of might that should have only existed in celestial tools. Under the tempering of the twofold heavenly tribulation, the divine demon sword was also able to undergo a comprehensive qualitative improvement. Ling Han continued to circulate drops of indestructible true fluid, speeding up the process of his recovery. However, the effects of the indestructible true fluid would decrease significantly when used in quick succession. It wasn't long before he consumed all 10 drops of indestructible true fluid. However, the twofold heavenly tribulation was still attacking him without mercy. Quang! A bolt of lightning arced down, severing one of Ling Han's arms. Godly blood sprayed into the surroundings. However, this blood was full of vitality, and it provided nourishment to the piece of land that it fell on. The plants and trees in this area instantly grew with renewed vigor, shooting up 30 or so meters. Quang! Another bolt of lightning descended, severing one of Ling Han's legs. Similar to before, a large swathe of land in the distance was transformed into an Elysian-like area. Countless godly medicines sprouted and grew, many of them reaching level 9 or even level 10. Quang! This bolt of lethal lightning struck Ling Han's neck, almost ripping his body into two. Blood exploded from his body and rained down on the surrounding lands, providing the entire abyss with vitality and nourishment. The abyss transformed from a land of desolation into a land of lush greenery. Quang! Heaven and earth were merciless, and they launched the killing blow. Pa! Ling Han was blasted into ashes. This time, Ling Han hadn't actively shattered his godly bones. Instead, he had genuinely been blasted into pieces. He's done for. A Supreme King tier was killed just like that. This was a King tier who could rival the power of Gu Daoyi. Brilliant! Nie Tiancheng and Shan Jingyi both sneered in delight. They had both been screwed over by Ling Han before. Even though they had reached the peak again, they had both fallen to the floor of the abyss again because of the hanging dog incident. In the end, they had failed to receive any benefits. Upon witnessing the death of Ling Han, they were naturally beside themselves with delight. It was as if they had eaten some sweet honey. With Ling Han dead, his heavenly tribulation naturally started to dissipate as well. However, just as the dark clouds started to dissipate, they immediately started to converge together again. What's going on? Everyone was confused by this sudden change. Perhaps heaven and earth wanted to mutilate his corpse. However, not even a single fiber of Ling Han's being was remaining. So, how could heaven and earth mutilate his non-existent corpse? Boom! They suddenly saw a burst of flames materializing in the sky. This flame then frenziedly spread throughout the sky, a figure gradually appearing from within it. This figure rapidly took shape before eventually stepping out. It's Ling Han. Holy fuck! Everyone opened their eyes as wide as they could upon seeing this, their heads completely numb with shock. He was clearly killed by heavenly tribulation, with not even an iota of his body remaining. In fact, even his tribulation had started to dissipate. So how has he come back from the dead? Ling Han slowly stepped forward, the boundless flames being absorbed into his body as he did so. His spirit and vitality were elevated to the extreme. Indestructible Heaven Scroll, rising from the ashes. There was a solemn expression on his face. This was his most powerful trump card, so what would he do if he were still unable to withstand this twofold heavenly tribulation? Quang! The tribulation continued to unleash violent strikes against him, the bolts of divine lightning becoming more and more powerful. This twofold heavenly tribulation had already lasted for almost 2 entire days. However, after unleashing a furious bolt of divine lightning, Ling Han's heavenly tribulation suddenly came to a stop, not unleashing any more attacks. Instead, the dark clouds dissipated, revealing the sun and bright sky that rested behind it. The terrifying heavenly tribulation had finally come to an end. Ling Han was riddled with wounds, and he heavily plunked down onto the ground. As strong as his willpower was, he still couldn't help but feel as if his body were about to collapse. Everyone gazed at him with respect and admiration in their eyes. In fact, there was even a hint of fear. It was as if they were looking at a freak, not a person. He had died, yet then come back to life again. Who had ever witnessed such an astounding scene before? Ling Han furrowed his brows. In order to overcome the heavenly tribulation, he had revealed his most powerful trump card in front of everyone else. As such, he would lose the element of surprise in the future. Fortunately, he still possessed another trump card. That was of course the Black Tower. It was even more indestructible than the indestructible Heaven's Scroll. In addition, he hadn't revealed the secret of the 9 Heavens Flame, either. This was a trump card that was no weaker than the Black Tower. "Gu Daoyi, come battle me!" Ling Han shouted as he stood up. The battle between Gu Daoyi and Empress Luanxing had already reached a critical and intense stage. Moreover, Gu Daoyi was enjoying the advantage. Although Empress Luanxing was astonishingly powerful, she still couldn't overcome the tremendous power of Gu Daoyi, especially since he possessed a divine fetus. If it weren't for the brick in her hands, perhaps she would have already been defeated long ago. How could Ling Han watch on as his wife was being ruthlessly attacked? Gu Daoyi stopped his attacks and turned around to gaze at Ling Han. There was a wary look in his eyes. Even he would struggle if he were attacked by both Ling Han and Empress Luanxing. "You want to battle against me?" he asked in a menacing voice. "Although husband and wife are one, I won't bully you this time. Let us battle, 1 against 1. Ling Han extended his arm, preparing to battle. Although he was bathed in blood, his aura instantly rose explosively at this moment. A mere ant-like. Pang! Gu Daoyi was still expressing his disdain, yet Ling Han had already launched a punch toward him, forcing him to instantly swallow his words. He hurriedly retreated 900 or so meters. Again? Gu Daoyi was beside himself with fury. This was exactly the same as before. He had wanted to mock and ridicule Ling Han, yet his words were forced back into his mouth by Ling Han's attacks every single time. He couldn't string together a single complete sentence. Detestable. Gu Daoyi gave up on trying to ridicule Ling Han. He was going to kill Ling Han. Mystical power of 10 lives. The mystical powers of all his lifetimes were unleashed one after another. In the end, they all combined to form a devastating combination attack. 9 other clones of Gu Daoyi then appeared, each representing one of his past lives. Attacking in unison, they unleashed the 10 mystical powers which then surged toward Ling Han. This time, he was attacking while at his full power. Moreover, he even had a saint tool in his hands. He was tremendously powerful. Ling Han smiled calmly, not hiding his own power, either. He immediately unleashed Heaven's might, forcefully suppressing Gu Daoyi's power by 2 stars. At the same time, he slashed down with his divine demon sword, sending brilliant celestial light into the surroundings. Raising his hand, boundless rays of divine light instantly shot outward, their brightness so great that the spectating cultivators could barely open their eyes. The cultivators in the second stage had mastered the sun physique with just a wisp of the sunstone's power. However, Ling Han had been cultivating inside this sunstone. Thus, the sum of the benefits received by all of the other cultivators was negligible before the benefits that Ling Han had received. It was also because of this that he had been able to advance from the early stage of the high extreme to the peak stage of the pinnacle level. In fact, if it weren't for the immense difficulty presented by the barrier to the eternal river tier, Ling Han could have advanced even further. However, if he had genuinely broken through to the eternal river tier, he would have been met with a 3-fold heavenly tribulation. If that had been the case, he definitely would have been killed. Gu Daoyi couldn't help but feel vexed. Chapter 1464 Recruiting Disciples. To other cultivators, obtaining the sun physique was something to be very happy about. However, to Gu Dawi, obtaining this mystical power was essentially the same as obtaining nothing. At most, it could only elevate his power by a minuscule amount. However, once Ling Han unleashed his sun physique, it caused his dazzle the heavens mystical power to appear dull and muted. One had to realize that the entire sun rock had almost all been refined by Ling Han alone. Thus, he possessed a sun physique that had reached the stage of great accomplishment. This sun physique wasn't the same as the sun physique of the other cultivators. Once it appeared, it unleashed a dazzling light and even a burst of scorching heat. In fact, the sunstone hadn't been used to just seal the nine heavens flame. Rather, the nine heavens flame had been born from within this sunstone, eventually growing into one of the 9 great ancestral flames. Indeed, this sunstone was a very freakish stone. Perhaps cultivating the sun physique to a stage of great accomplishment still wasn't enough for it to be qualified as a top-notch physique in the celestial realm. However, it was still definitely more powerful than Dazzle the Heavens. After all, Dazzle the Heavens was a mystical power that Gu Dawi had mastered in his first life. Taking all of his mystical powers into account, only his divine fetus would be able to suppress Ling Han's sun physique. Gu Dawi humphed coldly and said, "You've stolen my fortune and great opportunities. I'm definitely going to kill you." If he could obtain this physique, his Dazzle the Heavens would definitely elevate to a whole new level. Indeed, its improvement would certainly be far more than what he had received from the blessing of heaven and earth. Moreover, he had a feeling that Ling Han had received even more benefits than just this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have felt a sensation of apprehension just then. One had to realize that he possessed a divine fetus. What kind of precious treasure did Ling Han possess? It was something that could provoke even his divine fetus. "Dumb C***NT," Ling Han said with a cold sneer. He raised his divine demon sword, releasing a boundless sword chi as he did so. His aura was no weaker than that of Gu Dawi. "Humph! You think I'm afraid of you?" Gu Dawi roared as a brilliant light enveloped his body. Numerous symbols materialized on his body, and it was as if he had put on a suit of scaled armor. Surprisingly, he was able to obstruct the effect that was being released by Ling Han's heaven's might. However, this was only effective on his own body. The 9 clones that represented his 9 previous lives were still affected by the power of heaven's might. This was the power of his divine fetus. Ling Han's eyes lit up, and he immediately activated the Eye of Truth. He wanted to observe the symbols on Gu Douyi's body more closely. It was very likely that these symbols contained some of the secrets of his divine fetus, and it was very likely that they were celestial patterns. Such patterns had also materialized when he had been refining the 9 heavens flame. However, compared to those, the celestial patterns of Gu Dawi's divine fetus were naturally far inferior. After all, the 9 heavens flame was an ancestral flame of the celestial realm. It was an ancestral flame that could rival even celestial kings. However, Ling Han still couldn't comprehend these patterns. Ling Han felt that this was a pity. These celestial patterns were far too complicated. Even if he concentrated on just one, it would still take him an incredibly long time to comprehend and grasp. Moreover, there were at least tens of thousands of these celestial patterns. Forget about it. It's time to battle. Ling Han slashed his sword as he advanced toward Gu Dawi. There was the rumble of thunder, and there was also the brilliance of the sun. However, Gu Dawi was no pushover, either. He had a saint tool in his hands, and his original body was more so at its full power. He was no weaker than Ling Han. Although the power of his 9 clones had all been suppressed by 2 stars, they could still unleash a devastating might when they released their mystical powers in unison. However, what kind of physique did Ling Han possess? He didn't dare to face the attack of Gu Dawi's 10th generation body and Saint Tool head-on. However, he couldn't care less about the 9 clones that represented Gu Dawi's 9 previous lives. So be it if their attack struck him. At most, he would only receive some very minor injuries. Meanwhile, Gu Dawi also didn't dare to be struck by Ling Han's divine demon sword. This was a devastating sword that possessed immense destructive abilities. In fact, it was so powerful that it could even hack celestials to death. The two Supreme King tiers became locked in an intense battle. Their power was similar, and they continued to exchange blow after blow. Ling Han didn't unleash the Nine Heavens flame. This was his trump card, and unless he was confident that he could kill Gu Daoyi, he definitely wouldn't unleash it. Right now it was clear that he couldn't kill Gu Daoyi. They were on Wood Figure Planet right now, and thus they were all under the observation of the 10 saints of this planet. The divine senses of these saints were always watching over this planet. Cultivators like him, Gu Daoyi, second in the world, and the others were all the Supreme King tiers of their generation. Thus, how could these saints allow them to be killed? Apart from heavenly tribulation, which they couldn't interfere with, these saints would definitely appear to help if any of them was at risk of dying. That being the case, Ling Han obviously wouldn't reveal his trump cards prematurely. Sure enough, after exchanging several more blows, a saint suddenly appeared to stop the battle between Ling Han and Gu Daoyi. Under his saintly might, Ling Han and Gu Daoyi were unable to launch any more attacks. This was the case even though they were unafraid of his saintly might. Of course, this was only because they were incredibly powerful. Most of the other cultivators had already dropped to their knees. This was the Nine Azure Saint, the 9th disciple of the Star Sand Saint. At 300 million years old, he was also the youngest saint in the surrounding several hundred galaxies. It could be said that he was in his prime, and his chi and blood was at its most vigorous. He looked like a well-read middle-aged man, an indescribably graceful aura radiating from him even though his appearance was only ordinary. His aura was profound enough to move one's heart. This was a saint, someone who had reached the pinnacle of this realm. Thus, he naturally possessed a mighty and profound aura. When a saint was born, the heavens would rain a sweet dew to welcome their birth. When a saint died, the heavens would cry as the world grieved their passing. Everyone, immediately head to the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy. The recruitment process is about to begin. The Nine Azure Saint waved his hand as he said this, enveloping all of the cultivators and flying them to the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy. How quick was the speed of a saint? Moreover, this was under the condition that they weren't tearing apart and teleporting through space. Otherwise, they could arrive on another planet in a single stride. The Star Sand Martial Arts Academy appeared before their eyes. In fact, there were actually 9 campuses of the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy, each of them guarded by one of the Star Sand Saints' disciples. These saints would also be responsible for teaching the disciples in their own campus. Right now, they were at the 9th campus, the campus of the Nine Azure Saint. Sit here and wait. The recruitment process will begin in 3 days, the Nine Azure Saint announced. This was the request of a saint, and even someone as rebellious as Gu Daoyi didn't dare to go against his words. After all, he was only a measly cultivator at the heavenly body tier at this moment. A saint could kill him with a single thought. Everyone was very well behaved as they sat there quietly, waiting for 3 days to pass. Empress Luan Xing and the others all ran over to Ling Han. They hadn't seen each other for 10 years. Ling Han embraced the heavenly phoenix divine maiden in his left arm and Empress Luan Xing in his right arm. He then briefly filled them in about his encounters. Of course, he naturally couldn't go into much detail in such a public area. After all, the existence of the celestial realm was a very significant matter. 3 days passed by in a flash, and many more people arrived before the 9th campus of the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy. In addition to the king tiers who had participated in the competition in the Sunken Abyss Valley, there were also many more cultivators at the Mountain River tier and Sun Moon tier. Qualifying to enter the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy wasn't based on cultivation level alone. Rather, the recruitment was based on one's talent, comprehension ability, and physique. It didn't matter if one's cultivation level was low. After all, this was something that could eventually be raised. However, there were some natural characteristics that couldn't be changed, regardless of how high one's cultivation level was. If one wanted to become a saint, cultivation level definitely wasn't the key. Anyhow, the minimum requirement for entering the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy was reaching the pinnacle level in at least one major tier. Thus, there were only around 3,000 or so prospective disciples at this campus. Among them, there were over 2,900 rank 1 king tiers. There were far fewer rank 2 king tiers, only 300 or so. Meanwhile, there were only a measly 12 rank 3 king tiers. Apart from Empress Luan Xing, Gu Daoyi, Long Xiangyue, and the 4 others, Ling Han was a newly advanced rank 3 king tier. Regarding the 4 others, these were king tiers who had arrived not long ago. Because of this matter or that matter, these rank 3 king tiers hadn't managed to make it in time to participate in the competition in the sunken Abyss Valley. The 9 saints are about to recruit disciples. At this moment, an Eternal River tier elite walked out from the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy and announced the beginning of the recruitment process. Each person will be called up, and the 9 saints will decide whether or not they want to take you as a disciple. If only one saint shows interest, then you'll be taken as a disciple of that saint. If 2 or more saints show interest, then you can decide which saint you want to become a disciple of. Gu Daoyi. The elite called out the first name. Chapter 1465 The Greatest Prodigy of All Eternity. The first person to be called up was naturally the prodigy the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy valued the most. Gu Daoyi, the greatest prodigy of all eternity. Everyone gazed at Gu Daoyi with envy. He was publicly acknowledged as the most powerful prodigy. His physique was extraordinary, and he was more so capable of suppressing all other beings. However, it was a shame that he had failed to gain an overwhelming advantage over Empress Luan Xing or Ling Han. This left a slight blemish on his name. However, even so, the 9 saints still held him in higher regard, placing his name first. He had received the appreciation of saints. This was an incredible honor. Commotion instantly swept through the crowd of prodigies. In fact, the eyes of many of them went red with jealousy. In reality, Gu Daoyi didn't need to view saints with any respect. After all, he had once been a grand elder at the severing mundane tier. However, after living 10 lives, his personality had also become that of a young person. This was more so the case seeing that he had failed to defeat Ling Han and Empress Luan Xing after battling against them so many times. This irritated him greatly. Now that he was called up first, it was as if his name was being redeemed. This made him feel slightly smug and happy. He was brimming with pride as he walked forward. There was a large expanse of empty land before them, and the 9 saints were each seated on a stone lotus around this empty land. These stone lotuses were only 9 meters tall, yet wherever there was a saint, the land around them would become a saintly land. The expanse of empty land was illuminated by a soft divine light, with an intoxicating fragrance wafting from its surface. Fresh and blooming flowers also fluttered down from the sky, as if they were celebrating a grand event. "I desire to take him as my disciple," a saint said. "I desire to take him as my disciple," another saint said. "I desire to take him as my disciple. I desire to take him as my disciple." The 9 saints spoke one after another, all of them expressing their desire to take Gu Daoyi as their disciple. The 3,000 or so prodigies were all filled with jealousy when they saw this. These were 9 saints. Yet, they had all expressed their desire to take Gu Daoyi as their disciple. This was a profound honor. There was pride and haughtiness in Gu Daoyi's mind. In his eyes, even saints didn't have the right to take him as a disciple. However, he was only at the heavenly body tier right now, so what could he do about this? He had already completed the majority of his preparations in the Medicine King's cave. If he wanted to return to the Genesis tier as soon as possible, he would definitely have to rely on external help and power. The Star Sand Martial Arts Academy was his best choice. His aim was to win the appreciation of the Star Sand Saint so that he could be accepted as his 10th disciple. If that were to occur, he would obtain boundless resources from the Star Sand Saint, and would then have the confidence to become a Saint King in just 1,000 years. At that time, he could tear open a passageway to the Celestial Realm and return to his homeland. He would then be able to attend to his unfinished business. In this life, he, Gu Daoyi, was going to become a king tier of the Celestial Realm. He was going to battle for fortune with the true sons and true daughters of those powerful sects. "Gu Daoyi, whom do you wish to take as master?" The Star Sand Saint's 6th disciple, the Peaceful Radiant Saint, asked. Gu Daoyi pondered this for a moment. Right now, he still didn't have the right to directly become a disciple of the Star Sand Saint. It was evident that the Star Sand Saint still needed to observe their character and talent such that he could pick his favorite prodigy out of the 900 disciples. He would then take this prodigy as his direct disciple, and teach them with all of his heart and care. It was a shame that Gu Dawi couldn't announce that he had once been a Grand Elder at the Severing Mundane tier. Wouldn't it mean reaching the Genesis tier be mere child's play for him? However, if he truly announced this, how could he be sure that these saints wouldn't try to steal the fruits of his cultivation? He was feeling slightly regretful now. He hadn't killed Ling Han at that time, and he had allowed this hidden danger to grow more powerful. This was all because he had been worked up and convinced by Ling Han's words at that time. In fact, he couldn't have killed Ling Han even if he had wanted to. After all, Ling Han still had the Black Tower. Gu Dawi pondered for a moment longer before answering, "I want to become a disciple of the Black River Saint." The Black River Saint was the first disciple of the Star Sand Saint. His power was profound, and it was rumored that he might have already become a medium saint. However, Gu Dawi clearly hadn't chosen him because of this reason. Rather, it was because he felt that the Black River Saint was just barely worthy of teaching and helping him, being the first disciple of the Star Sand Saint and all. "Very well," the Black River Saint said with a nod. He gestured with his hand, and Gu Dawi instantly flew before the lotus platform that he was sitting on. There were 900 spots, and one of them had already been taken. Ling Han, the Eternal River Tier elite from before, called. Only in the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy would an Eternal River Tier elite become a mere host of an event. Ling Han was the second prodigy to be called over. The prodigies all wore strange expressions. The competition in the Sunken Abyss Valley had been a battle between the most powerful king tiers, where only one person could ascend the peak. Ling Han had emerged victorious in that competition, with Empress Luan Xing helping him hold Gu Dawi back. However, in this competition, he had been beaten by Gu Dawi. It was clear that the saints held Gu Dawi's physique in higher regard. "I desire to take him as my disciple. I desire to take him as my disciple. I desire to take him as my disciple." The 9 saints almost all spoke in unison. Although they held Ling Han in slightly lower regard, this was mainly because of his natural physique. However, he was still a piece of rare jade that was worth their effort in carving. This was also the reason why Ling Han was the second king tier to be called over. Of course, he was still inferior to Gu Dawi. After all, that was a divine fetus. His future prospects were boundless. In fact, even their master, the Star Sand Saint, had wanted to directly take Gu Dawi as his disciple. However, thinking about it carefully, he decided to also give the other prodigies a chance and some encouragement. With this in mind, he suppressed his urge to directly take Gu Dawi as his disciple. With the appearance of Gu Dawi, the other prodigies were all destined to become dull and lackluster, regardless of how freakishly prodigious they were. The gulf between them was far too large, so large that they didn't even have the right to compete against him. "Ling Han, what's your decision?" the Black River Saint asked. Ling Han's expression was calm, yet he was actually feeling extremely pissed off. Why was he viewed as inferior to Gu Dawi? They had battled against each other twice, and he hadn't been at a disadvantage either time. In fact, there were still many powerful trump cards that he hadn't used yet. If they fought to the death, rising from the ashes would even provide him with 2 extra lifelines. That being the case, how could he not kill Gu Dawi? With this in mind, why had he been called up after Gu Dawi? Had he lost? In the eyes of these saints, it was evident that one's physique was still more important. Gu Dawi possessed a divine fetus. "Fine. I'm eager to see your expressions when one day I eventually tread on the face of Gu Dawi." Ling Han mulled over his options. In reality, he didn't mind which campus he entered. After all, he had just obtained a large pile of secret techniques. Although these secret techniques couldn't be regarded as paramount when viewed in the context of the celestial realm, each one of them would definitely be profound enough to move the saints of the immortal realm. He swept his gaze over them before answering, "I want to become a disciple of the Tranquil Heart Saint." The 9 saints were slightly astonished. Although they were all saints, there were still differences in their power and abilities. Among the 9 saints, the Black River Saint was the most powerful. Moreover, he also specialized in using the sword. Thus, regardless of the situation, Ling Han should have chosen to become a disciple of the Black River Saint, and yet he didn't. Was it because of Gu Dawi? However, why had he chosen the Tranquil Heart Saint? Among the 9 saints, the 4th Saint Hardship Alchemy and the 8th Saint Tranquil Heart were slightly more peculiar. They weren't pure cultivators, but rather cultivators who had become saints through alchemy and formations, respectively. Perhaps Ling Han wanted to muck around and learn about formations from the Tranquil Heart Saint? However, becoming a saint through practicing formations was far too difficult. In the past billions of years, only the Tranquil Heart Saint had succeeded in doing so. It was abundantly clear just how difficult this path was. Very well, the Tranquil Heart Saint said. He had indeed become a saint through practicing formations. However, how profoundly powerful were saints? Could he not guide a measly cultivator at the heavenly body tier? He gestured with his hand, and Ling Han instantly flew before the lotus platform that he was sitting on. Empress Luan Xing? The Eternal River tier elite was slightly hesitant as he looked at the list of names before him. This person was actually using a title as their name? Moreover, her title was Empress? He couldn't help but feel displeased. However, the fact that she was ranked 3rd spoke volumes about her talent and abilities, as well as the value that the saints placed on her. Although his cultivation was higher at this moment, the fact that Empress Luan Xing had managed to rise above all other prodigies and rank 3rd among them proved that her future prospects were definitely limitless. Only one more saint could appear, but what was to stop her from advancing to the pinnacle level of the Eternal River tier and becoming a pseudo-saint? Thus, he forcefully suppressed his feeling of displeasure, not allowing it to show on his face. Empress Luan Xing gracefully walked over. Although she was breathtakingly beautiful and charming, with the ability to swoon millions upon millions of men, she was actually an incredibly proud and haughty woman. In her eyes, everyone was no more than an insect. Only one person deserved her love and attention. The crowd of prodigies suddenly fell silent, all of them intoxicated by the Empress' charm and beauty. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.